Hey everyone, tonight we're retaking a gentle stroll through one of the most uneventful periods in all of human history. No wars, no scandals, not even a mildly interesting royal decree. Just pure, uninterrupted stillness. This is the story of King Board III, a monarch so exquisitely unremarkable that even the history books tend to skip over his name, not out of disrespect, but because there simply wasn't much to say. And that's exactly what makes him worth talking about, especially when your eyes are heavy and the world feels a little too loud. Some stories are born to shake the earth, to ignite rebellion, to make your heart race. This one, however, is here to slow everything down. If you've come searching for glory, epic betrayal, or thunderous plot twists, you're not going to find them here. But if you're looking for the opposite, a peaceful spiral into soft boredom and warm forgetfulness, then you've come to the perfect place. King Board III ruled over a kingdom so quiet that even the trees forgot to rustle. The clouds didn't hurry. The sun never seemed in a rush to rise or set. Birds whispered, people napped, dogs didn't bark, they simply sighed. It was a land where nothing much happened, and everyone was okay with that. In fact, they preferred it that way. The kingdom didn't really have a name. On most maps, it was marked with vague labels like somewhere around here or near the forest. Probably, the capital city had one street. Maybe two. No one ever checked. There were no festivals, no uprisings, no royal weddings worth noting. The most thrilling event of the decade was when someone dropped a spoon in the palace kitchen. It bounced once and landed perfectly upright. People talked about it for weeks, but only in hushed tones. And yet, within this great sea of mediocrity sailed a man who would one day become king. Not because he wanted to be, but because he didn't actively avoid it. His journey was not forged in battle, nor paved with ambition. It was more wandered into, like stumbling into a nap he didn't plan to take. From the moment of his birth, tucked gently between two yawns, to the final peaceful breath of his reign, King Board III lived as he ruled, gently, slowly, and without making much of a fuss. Tonight, we'll follow that life. One breath at a time, a timeline without urgency. A legacy made entirely of silence, because maybe, just maybe, there's something beautiful in doing absolutely nothing. So close your eyes if you'd like. Or leave them half open. It really doesn't matter. Time moves differently here. Welcome to the reign of King Board III. May his uneventfulness guide you quietly into sleep. They say King Board III was born at the quietest moment of the quietest day of the year. It was sometime mid-morning after breakfast, but before anyone had done anything particularly interesting. The sun was neither warm nor cold, it just was. The sky was undecided pale gray with a hint of light, like it couldn't commit to being cloudy. The castle was sleepy, as usual, and the servants walked slowly, not from exhaustion, but because there was no real reason to hurry. In the royal birthing chamber, no one was particularly stressed. The Queen, Mildred of the Blanket Isles, lay on a mountain of soft pillows, sipping chamomile tea between contractions, and asking if it was truly necessary to finish giving birth before lunch. Only if it's convenient, the midwife replied, yawning. The baby arrived with as little fuss as one could hope for. No screaming, no drama, just a small sigh and a blink. He was handed to the Queen, who took one look at him and said, "He seems." Fine, that was the beginning of a reign defined by understatement. They named him Reginald Humbleton Flatton III, a name that sounded like it was chosen by committee. It was meant to honor 3 uncles, 2 cities, and 1 distant cousin who once balanced a ledger perfectly, but no one ever used the full name. His mother called him Reg. The maids called him that one. The stable boys sometimes referred to him as Little Cloud because he seemed to float through the palace halls without ever quite being present. From a very young age, it was clear that Reg wasn't interested in anything, not in a bad way. He simply observed the world as if it was mildly amusing, but not compelling enough to get involved with. He didn't cry, He didn't fuss. He didn't demand attention. In fact, there were long stretches of time when people forgot he was in the room. You'd open a cupboard and find Reg sitting inside, perfectly still, watching a speck of dust dance in the light. If you asked him what he was doing, he'd reply softly, just watching it float. As he grew, the palace adjusted itself around him. Tutors arrived and left without much change in his demeanor. When asked to recite his lessons, Reg would blink once, glance at the window, and say, "I suppose it's all still out there, isn't it?" His arithmetic instructor described him as gently disinterested in numbers. His music teacher claimed he had an instinct for silence. Once, during a painting lesson, he stared at a blank canvas for 3 hours and said, "I think it's finished. That canvas now hangs in the west hallway." Titled Absence. He wasn't lazy. He simply moved at the pace of erosion, slow, inevitable, and deeply unconcerned with whether or not anyone noticed. On his 7th birthday, the court planned a puppet show and a feast. Reg slept through the entire event, waking only to thank the puppets for their efforts before returning to his cushion. When offered presents, he asked if he could keep the wrapping paper instead of the gifts. "I like the crinkly sound," he explained. Unlike other royal children who aspired to greatness or fame or at least notoriety, Reg aspired to nothing. His dreams were not of crowns or battles or ballads sung in his name. He once told a gardener that his greatest wish was to one day sit still long enough that moss thinks I am part of the earth. It's unclear whether he was joking. Most assume he wasn't. By the time he was 10, Reg had developed a routine that never deviated. Wake at a reasonable hour, stare out a window, eat toast with no topping, visit the library to admire book spines he never opened them, and then nap in the same sunlit corner until the late afternoon. When invited to court dinners, he attended only if allowed to bring his own cushion. If not, he politely declined. "The chairs are too ambitious," he once said. "They want me to sit upright." His father, King Board II, was the only one who seemed genuinely proud of him. He saw in Reg not a lack of drive, but a purity of spirit. "He doesn't chase anything," the king said once. "And nothing chases him. That's rare." The advisors weren't so sure. They suggested tutors in economics, philosophy, perhaps a military mentor. Reg declined all offers with a blink and a shrug. When asked what he believed in, he replied, "Mostly cushions." Despite or perhaps because of his passive nature, Reg became a favorite among the palace staff. He never yelled, never demanded, never surprised anyone. Once, a servant accidentally spilled tea on his lap. Reg looked down, nodded thoughtfully, and said, "It's warmer than I expected." "Thank you." The servant apologized profusely. Reg waved a hand slowly and offered her a biscuit from his sleeve. As he entered adolescence, he remained a quiet fixture in the background of royal life. Courtiers began to refer to him as the furniture prince, because he was always there, quietly present, blending into the decor. He didn't attend dances, he didn't attend meetings. But he was never completely absent, either. Like a clock in a quiet room, you forget it's ticking, but it's always there. When Reg turned 16, a distant kingdom sent their princess on a diplomatic visit. She was bold, lively, full of fire and questions. She asked him what he did for fun. He said, "I sometimes sit so still I forget what year it is." She laughed, thinking it was a joke. It wasn't. The princess left after 3 days, claiming the palace air was too still. Reg agreed. "Stillness is heavy," he said, "but it's kind." At 17, Reg was taken on a tour of the outer villages. The people were polite. No one was particularly excited. Reg waved to them with a hand barely above his waist. He told a group of children that life is like soup, best enjoyed warm and with no rush. One of the children yawned. Reg beamed. Then, on a completely ordinary afternoon, as the sun paused behind a polite cloud, King Board II turned to his council and said, "I think he's ready." No fanfare, no formal ceremony, just a decision as quiet as the one who inspired it. The advisors nodded. After all, who better to rule over a kingdom that preferred naps to noise. And so it was decided. Reginald Humbleton Flatton III, the boy who once befriended a curtain tassel and named it Gerald, would someday wear the crown. Not to conquer, not to lead, but to continue a tradition of gentle governance, slow afternoons, and unremarkable stability. A king born between two yawns, destined to rule between many more. The day of Reginald Humbleton Flatton III's coronation began like any other. There were no birds heralding the dawn with joyous song. The sun, as if too polite to interrupt, rose slowly and without flare. The wind barely moved the curtains of the royal chamber, and the bells, which traditionally rang with thunderous grandeur, were accidentally muffled by someone who destored pillows in the bell tower weeks earlier and forgot to remove them. No one seemed to mind. It was, by all accounts, a perfectly unremarkable day to crown a perfectly unremarkable king. Reg himself had to be reminded that today was his coronation. He was sitting quietly in the royal conservatory, watching a snail make its way across the stone path, when a page approached, bowed, and said, "Your Highness, it is time." Reg blinked slowly. "Time for what?" he asked. "The crown," the page whispered, as if even the idea of raising one's voice on this day felt inappropriate. Reg stood without hurry, nodded to the snail, and walked barefoot back to the palace, because he had forgotten his slippers and decided that bending down to find them would be too much fuss. The great hall had been modestly prepared. There were no golden banners, no fountains of wine, no parades with trumpets or dancers. The decorations consisted of 5 candles, 3 of which had gone out, and a rug someone had borrowed from the guest room. A handful of nobles sat in the back row, chatting quietly about soup recipes. The Archbishop of Occasional Duties stood ready, holding the ceremonial crown with both hands and looking somewhat confused about whether this was truly the correct day. "Are we sure he's old enough?" he asked. "He's 21, someone replied. But emotionally, the Archbishop clarified. "He once cried over a chair," came the reply, but it was more of a contemplative whimper. The Archbishop shrugged and began the ceremony. Reg walked in with the expression of someone who had just been asked to recite a poem in a language he didn't speak. He wore a robe that was technically royal, but mostly looked like a very long, very soft bathrobe. The crown itself had been polished the night before by an apprentice who got distracted halfway through and only managed to clean the left side. No one noticed. As Reg approached the center of the hall, a court musician attempted to play a soft melody on the lute but broke a string on the second note. He nodded in apology and set the instrument aside. "Let's just imagine the music," someone whispered. "It's more restful that way." The Archbishop cleared his throat and began the official proceedings, which had been condensed from 17 pages to just 4 lines because no one could be bothered with the original version. "Do you, Reginald Humbleton Flatton III, accept the responsibilities of the crown?" Reg looked at him for a long moment, then replied, "Is this the part where I nod?" "Yes," the Archbishop said. Reg nodded. "Very good," the Archbishop replied. "And do you vow to lead the kingdom with wisdom, stillness, and a reasonable bedtime?" Reg thought about it, then said, "Yes, as long as no one expects surprises." "Certainly not," the Archbishop said with a smile. "Then it is done." He placed the crown gently on Reg's head, or as gently as one can place a crooked, slightly unbalanced piece of metal onto an uninterested scalp. The room was quiet, not out of reverence, but because no one was sure whether they were supposed to clap. After a few seconds, someone in the back gave a single, slow clap before thinking better of it. Reg raised a hand slightly, not in triumph, but to wave off any further enthusiasm. "Please," he said, "let's not make a moment of this." The nobles nodded in agreement. The ceremony ended, and refreshments were brought in, though it was mostly lukewarm tea and beige biscuits shaped like rectangles. Reg ate 2 and pocketed a third, claiming it was for philosophical purposes. No one declared a national holiday. No flags were raised. There were no official portraits painted that day. though a passing scribe did sketch a rough outline of Reg sitting near a plant. The caption underneath simply read, "A quiet moment." The scribe later sold the drawing to a bookstore, where it was mistakenly filed under botany. Reg's first official act as king came later, that afternoon, when he decreed that royal announcements should no longer be shouted from balconies, but instead printed on soft parchment and slid gently under citizens' doors. "We shouldn't disturb anyone unnecessarily," he reasoned. The royal printer had to order a new set of quills that made less scratching noise. Reg was pleased. By sunset, the kingdom was already forgetting that anything special had happened. Birds returned to whispering. The wind kept doing whatever it had been doing before. Somewhere in the distance, a sheep sneezed, but quietly. Reg sat in the royal study, not reading a book, but simply holding one. It comforted him to think of knowledge being nearby, even if unopened. He stared out the window at the garden, where a squirrel was rearranging pebbles. "He seems decisive," Reg murmured, sipping his tea. There was no coronation feast, but there was toast with unsalted butter and one boiled potato, served ceremonially, but eaten casually. The servants were unsure whether to bow every time they entered the room. Reg solved the issue by waving his hand in a slow circle and saying, "Let's all just pretend we're equals until further notice." This policy, written in 6 words and signed with a gentle smudge, would later be known as the Polite Parity Proclamation. That night, as the palace settled into its usual hush, Reg lay in bed, wearing the same nightgown he had worn every Tuesday since he was 13. The crown sat on a nearby chair, slightly tilted, with a biscuit resting beneath it. The stars outside blinked faintly, not with pride or grandeur, but with soft disinterest. Reg sighed not out of stress, but as a form of gentle punctuation to a day that had begun, occurred, and concluded without upsetting the rhythm of anything at all. He closed his eyes and thought, not about duty, not about legacy, not even about policy, but about how lovely it is when nothing demands your attention. In the quietness, he heard the kingdom breathing slow, even calm, and just before sleep took him, he whispered to no one in particular, "This is enough." After King Board III was crowned with the same energy one might use to gently close a door that was never really open, his reign began not with fireworks or speeches, but with a breakfast consisting of lukewarm tea and toast that had been slightly over-toasted, but not enough to cause concern. The royal council gathered that morning, expecting a formal declaration of priorities, perhaps even an outline of the new king's vision for the realm. Instead, they found Reginald slowly stirring his tea with a wooden stick he had found in the garden, staring thoughtfully at nothing in particular. "Your Majesty," the Prime Minister began carefully, "the kingdom awaits your first decree." Reg looked up as if waking from a particularly pleasant daydream and replied, "I believe shouting should be discouraged before noon, especially indoors." The council paused, unsure whether this was a jest. It wasn't, and thus, the first royal policy was born. The decree of morning softness was written in loose cursive on recycled parchment and declared that between sunrise and noon, all official communications should be delivered in a whisper, or better yet, through folded notes slipped discreetly under doors. The people found this immensely reasonable. From that moment on, the tone was set. King Board's rule would be one of quiet restraint, calm gestures, and a profound commitment to not disturbing the natural rhythm of things. When advisors asked him for a long-term economic strategy, Reg nodded and said, "Stability." Maybe a little less noise from the coin presses. When presented with the kingdom's 5-year infrastructure plan, he skimmed the summary, tapped his chin thoughtfully, and said, "As long as the roads don't encourage rushing." His interest in grand development projects was minimal. "Let the roads be comfortable. Let them wander a bit," he mused. Straight lines are too assertive. Engineers, initially baffled, later admitted that the slightly meandering roads led to fewer accidents and more scenic detours. In the matter of taxation, Reg created a system so simple it shocked the nobility. Instead of complex tables and tiered structures, he proposed what came to be known as the whatever's fair approach. Each citizen was invited to contribute what they felt they could afford each year, placing their offerings in soft linen envelopes labeled with phrases like "a little something" or "all I could spare." To everyone's surprise, the kingdom's coffers remained perfectly balanced. "Turns out," Reg said once while feeding a biscuit to a duck, "people are less stingy when you stop scolding them." When it came to education, King Board introduced the Optional Curriculum Act, a revolutionary shift that redefined how learning was understood. Schools became places of exploration, where students could attend if they wished, leave if they preferred, and spend entire afternoons lying under trees thinking about clouds without penalty. There were no grades, only gentle feedback like "nice effort" or "perhaps later." The result? Children learned at their own pace. Some became poets, others became nap specialists. A boy named Elliot learned how to mimic the sound of raindrops with his fingers and was later hired by the Palace of Ambient Sounds. Reg's environmental policy was equally unambitious and therefore wildly effective. Instead of enacting sweeping conservation laws, he issued a simple royal suggestion: let's not ruin things. The forests remained untouched, largely because no one had the energy to chop them down. The rivers flowed clean because dumping waste took effort. The citizens, inspired by their king's example, began planting small gardens simply because it felt peaceful. One village declared itself a zone of gentle gardening, where weeds were permitted to grow if they had a certain charm. On matters of justice, Reg proposed what he called the 3-day delay method. When someone was accused of a crime, the case would be paused for 3 full days, during which everyone involved was encouraged to reflect, nap, and possibly forget what had happened. Most disputes evaporated entirely. In serious cases, a council of elders would sit in soft chairs and listen without judgment. Punishments were rare, usually consisting of mild chores like sweeping a path or writing a poem to the offended party. Surprisingly, this system led to the lowest crime rate in the kingdom's history. "People become reasonable when you stop treating them like they aren't," Reg said during a particularly slow cabinet meeting that ended with a group yawn. Diplomatically, King Board's reign was described as a golden age of polite disinterest. He never pursued treaties aggressively, but welcomed foreign envoys with quiet tea ceremonies and plenty of pauses in conversation. Negotiations often ended in peaceful stalemates, which were considered victories by all involved. One visiting ambassador from the Kingdom of Evermark once asked, "So what do you hope to gain from this alliance?" Reg replied, "A quiet afternoon." The alliance was signed within the hour. Another notable moment came when Reg resolved a century-old border dispute by suggesting both kingdoms share the disputed hill on alternate weeks. When asked who would enforce the schedule, he replied, "Whoever remembers it." No one did, and the dispute ended not with a signature, but with collective apathy. The palace itself underwent gentle reforms under his rule. Loud clocks were replaced with soft chimes. Carpet was installed in every hallway to reduce echo. All furniture was required to be sit-worthy, but not so comfortable as to encourage long political discussions. The royal throne was replaced with a generously padded armchair. When asked if this undermined the dignity of the crown, Reg replied, "Dignity can take a seat too." One of the most endearing and quietly illusionary aspects of King Board's leadership was his insistence on the afternoon pause in national policy, encouraging all citizens to rest from 2 to 4 o'clock each day. Shops dimmed their lanterns. Offices placed a "back soon" probably sign on their doors. Streets fell into a hush. It was not enforced by law, but by the sheer pleasure of collective stillness. Productivity oddly increased. People grew kinder. Arguments were rarer. Even the animals seemed to respect the pause. A study by the Royal Bureau of Meandering Statistics showed that heart rates across the population dropped by a measurable percentage during those hours. In his 5th year on the throne, Reg was approached by a delegation of artists asking for funding to build a grand monument in his honor. They envisioned a towering sculpture made of marble and bronze, depicting the king in a thoughtful pose. Reg thought for a moment, then suggested they take the funding and create a public garden instead. Monuments are stiff, he said. Gardens stretch with the wind. The artist agreed. The garden was built, featuring winding paths, small benches, and a single plaque that read, "Dedicated to the feeling of not needing to rush." When asked how he wanted to be remembered, Reg declined to answer. "Remembrance is loud," he said once. "Forgetfulness is gentle." His legacy, as it turned out, would live not in epic songs or dramatic statues, but in the rhythm of a nation that had learned, finally, to exhale. Foreign diplomacy under King Bord III was widely considered the most tranquil chapter in an already peaceful kingdom's history. Where other monarchs hosted summits in gilded halls and flanked themselves with advisors and banners, King Bord preferred a modest patch of garden shaded by a leaning tree furnished with 2 old chairs, a table that wobbled gently, and a teapot that hissed like an old friend. His invitations were brief and informal. "If you're nearby, come by for tea." No rush. There was no seal, no flourish, just an invitation to be unimportant together. The first delegation to visit under this new system came from the Kingdom of Bravader, famous for ceremonial swords and loud opinions. They arrived in dramatic formation, trumpets, flags, armor that clanked with purpose. King Bord met them on the lawn, wearing a faded robe, soft indoor slippers, and holding a mug of mint tea. "Thank you for your enthusiasm," he said calmly. "Would you mind turning the trumpets down just a little?" Sir Harlan the Red, Bravader's ambassador, responded with confusion and formality. "We are here to discuss mutual defense and territorial rights." King Bord nodded. "Defense. Do you anticipate war?" "Not exactly," said Harlan. "But it is wise to prepare." The king blinked. "Interesting. I find preparation rather exhausting." They talked for hours long, only in clock time. Bravader presented diagrams and declarations. Reg offered shortbread biscuits and silences. No agreement was signed, but the ambassador asked for the biscuit recipe and returned home feeling oddly at peace. Other nations came next, one after another. Delegations prepared for tension and complexity, but encountered warm beverages, soft chairs, and a monarch who believed conversations were best when they wandered. The Kingdom of Sudran sought to debate sea passage rights. Reg walked them to a quiet pond, pointed to a family of ducks drifting in harmonious disorder, and remarked, "They seem to work it out without borders. Perhaps we could, too." No treaty was signed, but the Sudrunians left with unexpected reverence for the behavior of ducks. One naval officer even wrote a book, Floating Agreements, Lessons from the Still Pond. It became required reading in coastal academies. Occasionally, misunderstandings happened. The Empire of Grimfast, known for blunt strategy, mistook Reg's patient silence for tactical defiance. They issued a stern request for a response to their grain trade proposal. Reg, after 2 days of thought, replied not with terms, but with a poem, "Grains grow when left alone." "Let's grow together." The emperor was briefly insulted, then curiously moved. An agreement was signed, including a clause permitting each nation to contribute to a shared poetry collection. The press called it the Grain Verse Pact. It was never broken. Then came the Republic of Ontario, who constructed a colossal fortress near the border, a gesture usually interpreted as hostile. Most monarchs would have raised a mirror wall or summoned armies. King Bord sent a letter instead and signed, unsealed reading only, "May your walls bring you peace, we'll build none. You are welcome to visit." Along with it came a small box of tea samples and a hand-drawn map of local hiking trails. The Ventarians, prepared for conflict, instead found themselves drinking rosehip blend and discussing moss. The fortress was rebranded as a cultural rest stop. Not all visitors brought demands. A band of wandering philosophers from the highlands of Ermith requested an audience to explore the relationship between time and ownership. Reg met them under a fig tree. Nothing was said for 2 hours. At the end, he handed out ripe figs and said, "I believe we understand each other." The philosophers wept openly. One wrote a scroll titled "The Still Hour," lessons from a king who did nothing and meant everything. It circulated widely in monasteries and obscure university corners. King Bord's idea of diplomacy extended to all beings. When a swarm of bees built a hive in the royal chimney, kitchen staff panicked. A formal request was drafted for immediate extermination. Reg responded with a handwritten note. Perhaps they are cold. Let's build them a home. A beekeeper was summoned. A lovely hive was built beneath the old oak. The bees moved in, honey production increased, and peace was preserved. The bees were later granted honorary citizenship, and a tiny plaque was installed near the hive reading, "Friends who never interrupt." International summits became more restful under his example. While other leaders traveled with entourages, folders, and slogans, Reg brought a small pillow and a nearly empty notebook. At the Grand Assembly of the 12 Kingdoms, after hours of noise and declarations, he finally spoke. "True clarity," he said, "arrives after a nap." The room laughed, then paused, then agreed. A vote was held. All future summits would be shortened by half. Productivity rose. Blood pressure dropped. One of the more iconic moments in Reg's foreign policy occurred at the Great Conference of the Northern Borderlands. Tensions had simmered over a stretch of pasture land that no one particularly needed, but both sides refused to concede. For hours, envoys exchanged firm words and performed noble indignation. Then Reg stood, walked to the disputed land, lay down on the grass, and said, "Let us all be equally bored by this matter." There was a hush. Then someone else lay down, then another. Birds chirped. The breeze softened, the dispute faded. The land was eventually designated as shared grazing space for donkeys. There were no objections. Reg didn't think of diplomacy as strategy. He considered it shared quiet. When words run out, he liked to say, "You learn whether disagreement remains." His legacy wasn't etched in treaties or battles, but in soft-spoken moments where trouble was met not with retaliation, but with the absence of threat. His slippers, worn thin from gentle pacing between the garden and council room, were eventually displayed in the Museum of International Understanding, beside a cracked teapot and a framed copy of the Biscuit Treaty of Bravada. By the twilight of his reign, the kingdom had no enemies. Not due to dominance, but because it gave no offense. Neighboring rulers, once skeptical of Reg's methods, began making changes. One introduced national hammock hours, another banned urgent meetings before noon. A few installed fountains that bubbled nonsense poetry. Gradually, the culture of war faded. Not because of great speeches, but because hostility began to feel impolite. And Reg simply watched clouds drift across maps that no longer marked conflict. He stopped attending councils. He read more, napped more, smiled more. When asked once for his diplomatic philosophy, he thought a while, then said, "Diplomacy is what happens when you don't need to win. It's best conducted in slippers." The origin of the great bureaucratic nap remains one of the most gently contested mysteries of King Bord III's reign. Some believe it began with a misplaced memo in the Ministry of Administrative Simplicity. Others say it started when a clerk accidentally brewed lavender tea for the entire Office of Internal Records. Whatever the cause, the effect was undeniable. At precisely 2:30 on a Tuesday afternoon, the entire upper floor of the palace bureaucracy fell into an unplanned but extraordinarily synchronized slumber. It began innocently enough. Mr. Harlan's soft whistle, Deputy Subsecretary of Stamp Allocation, had been reviewing the year's envelope flap statistics when his eyelids, weighted by both data and despair, simply gave up. He slumped gently onto a stack of padded correspondence and began snoring with the faint, steady rhythm of someone who had lived too long in columns and rows. Unaware of the precedent he was setting, his assistant, Miss Philomena Twill, also nodded off mid-sentence while writing a memo titled "Urgency is Relative." By 3 o'clock, 17 departments were in various stages of dreamlike disengagement. Some fell asleep upright. Others curled gently beneath their desks. A few simply stared at the ceiling in a state best described as intentional resting. No one made a fuss. No bells were rung. There was no emergency meeting called. Instead, the rest of the palace quietly, followed suit. Word of the widespread slumber drifted slowly up the winding staircase of the palace to the king's antechamber, where Reginald Humbleton Flatton III was seated in his usual thinking chair, contemplating the emotional complexity of soup. A courtier approached and whispered, "Your Majesty, the bureaucracy appears to be asleep." Reg blinked slowly, then replied, "Good, perhaps they'll dream of simpler forms." Rather than reversing this development or initiating any form of disciplinary action, King Board issued a new decree titled Regarding the Rhythmic Rebalancing of the Royal Workforce, which, in its entirety, read, "Let sleeping clerks lie. If productivity must happen, let it happen after tea." No other instructions were issued. From that moment, it was accepted that after lunch, the administrative heart of the kingdom would beat a little more slowly, or perhaps not at all. The nap became not just a habit, but a fixture, a structural element of governance. Filing systems were restructured to accommodate pillow drawers. Meetings were scheduled only before noon or well after 4. Scribes wrote in softer ink. One department, the Bureau of Unspecified Permissions, began communicating entirely through notes written during lucid dreaming sessions. The effects were, unexpectedly, positive. With rest came patience. With patience came clarity. Reports that once took 6 frantic drafts were now completed in 2, albeit slowly, and with better handwriting. The Council of Considerable but not urgent decisions started hosting its sessions on beanbags, and debates, once fueled by ego, were now punctuated by long, thoughtful silences during which participants occasionally dozed off and came back with gentler opinions. Even the architecture of the palace began to change. The marble floors were overlaid with felt. The chandeliers dimmed themselves automatically at nap time. A harpist was hired to play ambient arpeggios in the central atrium, though eventually it was agreed her mere presence was soothing enough and she stopped playing altogether. The harp remained as decoration. In the villages beyond the palace, the movement spread. Bakers took mid-batch naps, resulting in fluffier bread. Shepherds reclined with their flocks and claimed they heard the sheep offering life advice in dreams. Children attending school were encouraged to rest between letters of the alphabet. A nap ... be nap. Teachers claimed retention improved. Test scores weren't measured because tests were deemed aggressively alert. Instead, students were asked how they felt. Most said, "Fine," and that was enough. One might expect such a system to collapse under its own indifference, but instead it created a soft and steady efficiency. When a courier from the neighboring empire of Harshvold delivered a strongly worded complaint about trade delays, he found the Royal Trade Office empty, save for a cat napping on a stack of ledgers. The courier, unsure what to do, lay down beside the cat. Hours later, he returned to his king with a handwritten note that read, "Perhaps urgency, the real delay." The message made the rounds of Harshvold's court for weeks, confusing and ultimately relaxing everyone. Hostilities were withdrawn, trade resumed at its own pace. Not all responded with enthusiasm. Lord Pendleton Brash, the self-appointed champion of promptness, attempted to outlaw naps within his jurisdiction. His office productivity dropped. Staff revolted quietly by replacing his ink with chamomile tea concentrate. His reports began to smell relaxing. Eventually, he, too, succumbed to a soft cushion behind his desk and was last seen humming lullabies to a potted plant. Artists praised the nap as a muse. A painter created a 5-canvas series titled The 5 Stages of Peaceful Ignoring, which won a prize that no one remembered entering. A composer wrote an orchestral piece consisting of a single sustained note played over an hour by a cello placed in an empty room. Audience members reported feeling healed. Though unsure of why, King Board himself embraced the new rhythm. He began issuing edicts in the form of dreams, dictated the following morning over breakfast. One such dream edict involved turning the entire Treasury Department into a forest library. Another instructed the Ministry of War to convert its budget into blankets. Both were carried out without question. No one wanted to argue with a man so deeply rested. His naps, once private, became symbolic. Once a week, he would lie in the center of the palace courtyard on a padded stone slab, eyes closed, hands folded, surrounded by officials who would sit nearby in meditative silence, waiting not for orders but for atmosphere. As the years passed, the great bureaucratic nap became not just a feature of King Bord's reign, but a philosophy. Foreign dignitaries stopped asking about economic metrics and began inquiring about the kingdom's nap technique. Scholars visited to study sleepful governance. One philosopher famously declared, "Where others lead by will, this one leads by won't." Reg responded with a smile and a yawn. "Won't is underrated," he agreed. In the end, the great bureaucratic nap didn't change the kingdom through ambition, revolution, or force. It changed everything by changing nothing all at once, by allowing time to pause and patience to blossom where panic once lived. It left behind no monuments, only cushions, no anthems, only hush, and no laws, save one unwritten rule: if you must serve, serve softly and maybe lie down halfway through. Of all the royal decrees issued during the reign of King Bord III, and to be fair, there weren't that many, the most famous, the most controversial, and the most thoroughly relaxed was simply titled "On Doing Less." It was not a long document. It wasn't even written on royal parchment. Legend says it was scrawled in pencil on the back of a teabag label and handed to a footman who was halfway through his own nap. The footman, understanding the gravity of the moment in a very roundabout way, passed it along to the Secretary of General Messages, who promptly forgot about it for 3 days. When it finally reached the Office of Distribution, no fanfare accompanied its arrival. A clerk read it slowly, blinked twice, and said aloud, "Well, that seems reasonable," and then, without edits, footnotes, or any consultation with the Department of Complication, it was published across the kingdom. The decree read, "Henceforth, let it be encouraged, not required, not enforced, simply encouraged, that people do fewer things, and do them with more stillness. Whatever doesn't need doing right now may not need doing at all. Think before you act, and then maybe take a nap before thinking again." It wasn't immediate, but it was strangely effective. The kingdom, already tuned to the slow heartbeat of King Bord's reign, found itself adjusting naturally. Bakers reduced their menu to 3 types of bread and discovered that customers were happier not having to choose between 12. Barbers stopped offering haircuts with names like the Warrior S-Chop or the Royal Razor, and simply asked, "Do you want it shorter, or do you want it softer?" Builders, once obsessed with angles and sharp designs, began making rounder buildings, gentler staircases, and windows designed not to impress, but to frame the sky. The idea wasn't laziness, though many tried to label it that. It was deliberate unbusyness, conscious underdoing, a sort of elegant idleness that required practice. Some called it leisure with awareness. Others called it just enoughism. One pamphlet printed by the Society of Slightly Curious Thinkers defined it as the art of moving without stirring dust. Whatever name it took, the effect was unmistakable. People began to breathe slower, to eat slower, to listen with less urgency, and most shockingly of all, to talk less and say more. Of course, there was resistance. A few corners of the kingdom had built entire identities around doing too much. The Grand Guild of Timekeepers protested that fewer tasks meant fewer clocks. The Association of Personal Schedulers held a loud and meticulously timed demonstration that lasted 12 minutes exactly. One lord submitted an official complaint in triplicate, arguing that if people did less, then surely he would be more bored. The irony was lost on him, but not on others. King Bord himself responded with a rare public statement, delivered not from a throne, but from a hammock suspended between 2 pillars of moderate importance. He said, "Doing less is not the absence of meaning, it is the refusal to rush toward it. And if you find yourself bored, consider it practice." That last line was painted, without permission, onto the side of a barn, then copied onto 100 notebooks, then sung in a song that consisted mostly of hums. It became a sort of anthem, not loud or rousing, but hummed quietly while walking home from slow errands. Children repeated it in classrooms as an excuse not to finish assignments, and teachers allowed it, because half the time, the children thought of better ideas while lying on the floor looking at the ceiling. Musicians wrote fewer notes, painters used fewer colors, writers chose fewer words, but better ones. The result was not silence, but a different kind of sound, the kind you had to lean into to hear. The kind that didn't demand your attention, but welcomed it gently when you were ready. Even the economy adapted. Merchants, instead of shouting to sell their goods, placed them on cloths beside signs that read, "This is here if you need it." Shopping became less of a pursuit and more of a stroll. Coinage was redesigned with smoother edges and quieter clinks. Some businesses began accepting intent as a form of partial payment. "I meant to buy this," a customer might say, and the shopkeeper, depending on the item and the sincerity, might say, "Then keep it, and return someday with something you no longer need." Trade slowed, but didn't stop. It simply breathed between transactions. Government offices shrank their responsibilities. Redundant departments were merged not for efficiency, but for comfort. One famous merger brought together the Ministry of Weather Records and the Department of Moods. Their combined mission became to observe and reflect on things that change. Staff reported higher job satisfaction. A weekly newsletter titled Probably Cloudy included both sky reports and gentle affirmations. Subscription was optional. Most read it anyway. King Board's court became known as the Circle of Enough. Nobles were no longer measured by their ambition, but by their ability to say, "That'll do." Rewards were given for moderation. A knight was once honored for declining to slay a dragon after discovering it was just lonely. He was knighted on a Tuesday afternoon in a ceremony that lasted only 8 minutes and concluded with everyone sharing soup. The dragon was later employed as a museum tour guide and spoke very softly. Religious leaders praised the decree for restoring the sacred rhythm of rest. Temples filled not with sermons, but with soft sounds, wine chimes, water bowls, slow breathing. Pilgrimages were replaced with gentle walks around the garden. The divine, they said, was easier to hear when one wasn't trying so hard. One monk declared, "Doing less is an act of trust that the world will still spin without you pushing it." People listened, then they sat down. As the decree rippled through the years, it grew not louder but quieter. And in that quiet, it became part of the landscape. In the way trees were pruned to let light fall slowly, in the way street musicians played lullabies instead of marches, in the way people greeted each other not with a handshake, but a nod that meant no pressure. No one knew exactly when the kingdom changed. There was no revolution, no celebration, only a long, shared sigh that lasted a decade. And somewhere in the middle of that sigh was a king in a soft robe, sipping warm milk, watching clouds move in no particular direction, and smiling not because he had done something great, but because, for once, no one had asked him to. Every peaceful reign, no matter how uneventful, eventually brushes up against something that resembles a scandal. In the case of King Board III, it happened not with a betrayal or battle, but with a teacup. The event began on a Monday, which had been unofficially rebranded across the kingdom as Mild Start Day, a time to delay all sense of urgency by at least until after the second cup of tea. On this particular Monday, a palace servant named Elspeth Bumblebrook delivered the king's morning tray as she had done every day for nearly 8 years, soft-boiled egg biscuit plum jam and Earl Grey steeped for exactly 4.5 minutes. Except this time, by accident, the tea had been replaced with chamomile, a sleepy mix-up, nothing more. But when King Board took a sip, paused, sniffed the cup, and then declared, "Something's missing, and I'm not entirely bothered," the palace went into a barely perceptible flutter of unease. That single comment delivered not with outrage, but with curiosity sparked what would later be described in hushed tones as the incident of the unintentional herbal infusion. At first, no one noticed, but when the Minister of Tea Affairs, a role invented mostly to placate a retired librarian, heard about it, she raised a pale eyebrow and muttered, "Deviation." She filed a quiet report, which sat unread for 5 days, before being noticed by the Office of Potentially Concerning Circumstances. They, in turn, drafted a memo titled Possible Beverage-Based Irregularity, which was left in a pigeonhole until a very enthusiastic junior clerk decided it sounded too exciting to ignore. By the time the news reached the Royal Council, the story had grown more potent than any tea bag ever steeped. Rumors drifted like overcooked porridge. Was the king losing his refined taste? Had he issued an unspoken decree in favor of chamomile? Was this a quiet coup by the anti-caffeine faction? None of these things were true. Of course, the king himself didn't even remember what he'd said. When asked directly whether he had preferences regarding his tea, he blinked slowly and replied, "As long as it's warm and not judgmental." Nevertheless, factions emerged. The Progrès League argued fiercely in favor of tradition, citing leaf consistency and morale. The chamomile contingency responded with pamphlets featuring daisies and slogans like "Calm is power." For 3 weeks, the palace was filled with debates as general as they were unnecessary. Banners appeared in front of government buildings, steeped with intention, but truthfully, let leaves decide. A group of rogue herbalists declared neutrality and started an underground movement called the lukewarm middle. The king, meanwhile, read a book about clouds and wondered why his courtyard fountain now gurgled more intensely. Foreign diplomats caught wind of the unrest and sent polite inquiries. "Is the kingdom destabilizing?" asked one ambassador from a nation where overreaction was a national pastime. The reply came in the form of a box of assorted teas and a note that read, "Nothing is boiling here." In fact, the people of the kingdom were, if anything, slightly more cheerful. The scandal had given them something to politely discuss while waiting for scones. One elderly woman was overheard saying, "It's been years since I've had an opinion," before voting for lemongrass in a completely unofficial and largely ignored tea preference poll. What made the so-called scandal truly remarkable was that it began and ended without a single person raising their voice. No punishments were issued, no titles revoked, no one was exiled, except perhaps voluntarily to the countryside for a bit of quiet. The press, consisting of 2 sleepy poets and a man with excellent handwriting, ran articles with headlines like "This might be something, but probably isn't," and "Palace tea slightly different. Nation reacts with mild curiosity." One column suggested that perhaps every now and then a kingdom needed a false emergency to release the pressure of peacefulness. Otherwise, it read, "We might start worrying that we've forgotten how to worry." Eventually, Elspeth Bumble-Brooke was asked to appear before the king, not for punishment, but for a chat. She wore her best apron and carried a tray just in case. King Bord greeted her with a warm smile and invited her to sit. She hesitated. "But I'm just a server, Your Majesty," he replied, "and I'm just a man who drinks whatever's put in front of him." They talked for nearly an hour, mostly about gardening. At the end of the conversation, Reginald asked her, quite seriously, "What's your favorite tea?" She blushed and admitted she liked peppermint. The next morning, peppermint was quietly added to the royal stores, and no official statement was made. The scandal, if it could be called that, faded like a footprint in flour. People returned to their routines. The banners were taken down and repurposed as blankets. The herbalists went back to drying leaves, and the royal fountain resumed its usual gurgling, though no one was quite sure if it had ever changed. In the official historical records, the entire incident was filed under an episode of general national interest. In an appendix, it was noted that during the affair, the kingdom saw a slight uptick in smiling, a noticeable decrease in indigestion, and a brief but measurable surge in biscuit consumption. Years later, children would ask their grandparents, "Did you live through the Great Tea Thing?" And the grandparents would smile and say, "Oh yes, we all had opinions." It lasted nearly a month, and then they would fall asleep halfway through explaining what exactly the opinion was about. Scholars would write papers titled "Infusions of Identity," "Steeping Meaning in a Quiet Era," and "Crisis Management in the Age of Contentment." None of these papers were widely read, but they were beautifully typeset. As for King Board, he continued sipping whatever was placed before him, never asking questions, never needing answers. To him, it was just a cup of tea, warm, welcoming, unconcerned with the fuss of kingdoms. And perhaps that was the real scandal, that in a world obsessed with meaning, he had dared to enjoy something without needing to define it. It began, as many curious things in the kingdom tended to, not with a grand proclamation or a thunderous parade, but with a small sign near a vegetable patch. The sign read, "Reserved for snail deliberation." Most people assumed it was a joke. Perhaps a gardener with too much imagination. Perhaps an old wizard playing with metaphors, but day after day, the patch remained undisturbed, and the snails, many of whom had lived their entire lives without so much as a deadline, began congregating there with a purpose no one fully understood. At first, there were only 2 or 3, slowly inching their way across the soft earth in gentle spirals. But by the end of the season, dozens had gathered, silent, glistening, deliberate. Locals began calling it the Parliament of Snails, and soon the name stuck. Visitors came not to watch anything in particular, for there was little to see, but to experience the strange comfort of slow-motion governance. Children knelt to observe what they believed were important conversations about leaves, moisture levels, and moss economics. Adults sat on nearby benches and sighed with relief at a world so unbothered by efficiency. Eventually, someone brought a small sign that read "Now in Session," and propped it up with a twig. News of the snail parliament reached King Board III not through official channels, but via a gardener named Lenton, who mentioned it casually while trimming the palace hedges. The king, who had recently grown bored of traditional policy discussions which involved too many diagrams and not enough silence, became immediately intrigued. A parliament that makes no sound and requires no voting. He mused aloud. How elegant. That week, he paid the snails a quiet visit, dressed in his softest slippers and accompanied only by a mild breeze and a plate of cucumber slices. He sat beside the vegetable patch for over an hour, watching the creatures glide in subtle loops. No minutes were taken, no laws were passed, but when he stood to leave, he whispered, "I feel represented." Within days, the snails were granted honorary legislative status, not that they requested it, or seemed to notice. But King Board insisted that all future policy proposals be placed before the snail circle for quiet observation. A new document was drafted, known as the Charter of Deliberate Creatures. It stated, quite plainly, that any matter not requiring haste could, and should, be reviewed by beings with no particular interest in human urgency. Bureaucrats adapted quickly. Instead of arguing in long, spiraling meetings, they would place a matter of policy on a stone slab near the snails and return 3 days later. If the paper had been slimed, the motion was considered touched by nature. If untouched, the issue was deemed not yet ready. No one really questioned this. It felt more honest than most debates. Some critics, as always, emerged. One lord called the practice an insult to proper procedure, but when he attempted to mock the snails by placing his family crest beside the patch, the snails surrounded it and refused to move for 8 days. The public interpreted this as a soft but firm censure. The lord resigned quietly, took up painting slow landscapes, and later published a memoir titled Gently Shamed by Gastropods. Over time, the snail parliament began to influence culture. Architects designed more round buildings, roads curved slightly more, favoring scenic detours. Public signs changed from "Do not enter" to "Consider entering slowly." Even public speeches became more ponderous, filled with pauses that left room for thought or daydreams. The national anthem was rewritten to be played entirely on harp at 1/4 speed. It took 23 minutes to perform and was often used as background music for naps. Artists and philosophers flocked to the snail circle, hoping to witness a perfect moment of almost nothing. One poet claimed to have received an entire sonnet from a snail, who stopped beside his sandal and blinked once, very slowly. The poem, when published, was titled "The Whisper Between Raindrops," and won the prestigious Nearly Meaningful Award. Another artist painted a canvas of blank space, titled their legislative agenda, and hung it upside down to represent how little actually needed doing. Critics called it brilliant, others forgot it was there. The royal council, not to be outdone, invited a small group of snails into the palace chambers. A tiny stone garden was created in the center of the room, and once a month, proposals would be read aloud while the snails slowly explored. Observers noted that whenever snails gathered near the left corner, the proposals seemed to work better in practice. A new phrase entered palace language: "It has the left corner snail blessing." No one knew what it meant. Everyone agreed it was good. At one point, a visiting prince from a neighboring, much noisier kingdom asked what the snails had actually accomplished. The court historian, who had once written an 800-page treatise on nothing at all, responded, "They've reminded us that not every movement must lead somewhere, and not every silence is empty." The prince, bewildered, returned home with a headache and a pamphlet titled In Praise of Unconclusion, which he later used as a bookmark for a novel he never finished. Years passed. The snail circle expanded. A small pond was dug nearby, not for function, but for aesthetic harmony. Grass grew a little taller in the area. As no one dared mount it close, children left notes for the snail's tiny scrolls tied with string, and sometimes, after rain, they swore the messages were slightly repositioned. One child claimed the snail had answered her question about what clouds dream of. She said the answer was cool shadows and soft thunder, and for reasons no one could explain, that answer was never questioned. Kingboard visited the snails often. Sometimes he brought breadcrumbs. Sometimes he brought nothing at all. He would sit and let time expand gently around him, the way steam rises from a teacup or ideas wander before they become words. The snail circle never became law, never passed legislation, never enforced a single thing. And yet, in that still patch of earth, the kingdom found a center more steady than any stone tower, and so the Parliament of Snails endured not as a governing body, but as a living reminder that slowness can be sacred, that presence can be policy, and that sometimes the best decisions are the ones that take their time. Kingboard III was not particularly fond of conclusions. It wasn't that he disliked closure, he simply didn't trust it. He believed that most endings were too neat, too sudden, as though someone had decided a story was complete just because they had run out of parchment. Life doesn't end at the bottom of the page, he once muttered, halfway through not finishing a speech about irrigation reform. He paused mid-sentence, looked at the birds, and wandered off. No one asked him to continue. That moment became emblematic of a broader tendency that defined not just his leadership, but the entire ethos of his kingdom, the gentle, determined art of not quite finishing. It wasn't laziness, or indecision, or fear. It was, if anything, a quiet rebellion against the tyranny of completion. Where other monarchs issued decrees carved in stone, Kingboard preferred declarations written in chalk, left out in the rain to see what remained. He often drafted royal policies that began with henceforth and ended with ... or perhaps not. Let us think further. One famous policy regarding tax reform consisted of 3 bullet points, the third of which simply read, TBD. He once began composing a national epic, intended to rival the great heroic poems of neighboring lands. He titled it The Saga of Seymour, the Gentle Champion, and dictated the opening verse with considerable enthusiasm. In times of mist and mild concern, there lived a man who almost learned. And then he stopped, blinked, and said, that might be enough. The epic remained exactly 1 line long. Scholars argued for decades about its possible meanings. One suggested it was a commentary on the futility of knowledge. Another claimed it was simply a very slow joke. Neither theory was confirmed, nor denied. Throughout the kingdom, the philosophy of unfinishedness took root. Buildings were designed with one corner left purposefully incomplete. For future thoughts, the architects would say, nodding wisely. Painters exhibited canvases with broad brushstrokes that faded off the edge, accompanied by plaques reading, to be continued, by someone else. Tailors began sewing shirts with one button missing, inviting the wearer to reflect on what they truly needed. Some villagers, in tribute to the king's example, began writing letters with no final sentence. Dear cousin, I've been meaning to tell you about the strange goose that wandered into town last week, and nothing more. The cousin would smile, knowing the story probably had no conclusion, and that was just fine. Even time itself seemed to follow suit. Clocks in public squares stopped marking seconds and instead gently pulsed to indicate that time was generally occurring. Calendars were printed with empty days labeled possibility. Historians grew frustrated. They found it nearly impossible to pinpoint when events officially began or ended. When did the great bureaucratic nap begin? One asked. Somewhere between tea and biscuit, came the reply. And when did it end? Has it? The historian threw his quill in the air and became a potter. King Board's speeches became legendary for their structure or lack thereof. He would begin with a premise, such as the importance of gentle weather, then meander through anecdotes about clouds, then digress into a brief reflection on the way rain feels on silk sleeves, then pause to sip tea, and finally conclude by saying, "Well, we'll see." The audience would applaud, not because they agreed, but because they were glad nothing had been forced into conclusion. That was a lovely beginning of an idea, someone once said, and the phrase was stitched onto a pillow in the royal guest room. The king's advisors, once frustrated by his refusal to finalize anything, gradually adapted. The royal treasurer began submitting half budgets, with footnotes such as "We could finish these numbers, but wouldn't that limit our curiosity?" The Minister of Roads proposed a new highway that deliberately curved out of sight and ended in a meadow, labeled to be continued when necessary. Tourists flocked to the spot and reported a deep sense of calm upon reaching a destination that refused to call itself one. The only true challenge came from the royal architect, Sir Pinder Grust, who prided himself on his perfectly measured buildings and fully enclosed towers. He grew increasingly irritated by the fashion of leaving things open. One morning, he presented the king with a model for a completely symmetrical palace with no unfinished bits. "It is flawless, Your Majesty. No gaps, no loose ends." King Board walked around it twice, sighed gently, and tapped one corner with his cane. "This corner," he said, "could be an invitation." "To what?" Pinder asked. "To breathe," the king replied, and walked away. The architect, shaken, left the profession and took up slow embroidery. There was a rumor that the king had once almost finished something, a letter, a garden, a thought, but no one ever found evidence. Even his memoir, which began with the sentence "I was born on a rather indifferent morning," ended halfway through a recipe for stewed pears. The rest of the pages were blank, except for the occasional pressed flower. It became a bestseller among people who didn't like reading too much. Foreign dignitaries struggled with the kingdom's refusal to finalize treaties. Diplomats from elsewhere were used to crisp signatures and wax seals. Instead, they received documents signed tentatively yours, with expiration dates labeled probably never. One treaty regarding sheep grazing rights included a footnote that read, "This agreement is currently comfortable, but subject to change if the sheep have strong opinions." Surprisingly, most conflicts were avoided, as neighboring nations didn't quite know how to argue with uncertainty. "They are impossible to oppose," said one flustered ambassador. They never declare anything firmly enough to resist. As the years went on, the king aged without announcing it. He never celebrated birthdays, believing that declaring a number was a kind of imprisonment. When asked his age, he replied, "I'm nearly whatever I feel like." His beard grew slowly, as though respectful of his philosophy. His robes were often half-buttoned, one sleeve rolled, a collar slightly askew, not from carelessness, but from comfort. "Perfect symmetry," he said once, "is exhausting." The kingdom grew older with him, gently and indistinctly. There were no monuments to great victories, because there had been no battles. There were no national holidays marking dramatic change, because change happened like moss quietly, wherever there was stillness. And in the palace, the king continued his days as he always had, beginning thoughts, opening doors, walking paths with no end, sipping tea he might finish, or might not. And so it was that the art of not quite finishing became the greatest accomplishment of a king who never aimed for accomplishments. He left behind no final message, no last words, no dramatic conclusion. Only a feeling shared by those who lived in his time and passed gently into sleep each night that the story of their lives didn't need to end to be complete. Of all the festivals celebrated during the reign of King Board III, and there were many ranging from the festival of intentional pacing to the day of unfinished toasts, the most beloved and arguably the most beautifully pointless was the slightly melancholy Festival of Clouds, held annually on the second grayest day of mid-spring, when the sun was content to remain diffused, and the sky resembled a politely confused bedsheet. The festival was less a celebration and more a collective sigh of the kingdom's gentle soul. It began quietly, as all important things in the kingdom tended to. One year, an old man named Thimble Uxley sat in a field and watched the clouds for 8 hours straight. No picnic, no book, no commentary, just quiet watching. When asked what he was doing, he replied, feeling slightly poetic for no particular reason. The next year, 3 neighbors joined him. They brought sandwiches, but forgot to eat them. A week later, someone painted a sign that read, "Cloud Appreciation. Bring your own silence," and just like that, a tradition was born. The king, upon hearing of this practice, sent a note written in blue ink that simply read, "Approved," softly. He did not attend the first few festivals, not because he disapproved, but because he felt the clouds didn't need him. "Let them gather without gravity," he said, smiling at his own vague wording. Eventually, he did show up, unannounced and barefoot, wearing a sweater that may or may not have belonged to someone else. He lay in the grass beside an elderly woman who was humming a tune with no melody and asked, "Do we expect anything from the clouds today?" She replied, "Only that they remain cloud-like." From that moment, he never missed the festival again. The festival had no schedule, no performances, and no designated speakers. The only rule was, speak if you must, but let your voice be lighter than the sky. People brought blankets, light snacks, notebooks with blank pages, instruments they did not play, and poems they never finished. Some wrote things in the air with their fingers. Others listened for messages in the breeze and nodded solemnly at nothing in particular. It was the sort of gathering where doing nothing was considered a shared accomplishment. One year, a visitor from a distant land arrived with drums and energy and slogans. He stood up and proclaimed, "Let us celebrate the clouds with joy." Several people blinked at him. One child politely whispered, "We are already celebrating." Just very slowly, the visitor sat down, unsure what to do with his enthusiasm. By sunset, he had adopted a sighing posture and was drawing spirals in the dirt. He returned home weeks later, claiming to have learned the rhythm of near stillness, and began hosting his own version, which failed spectacularly due to too much planning. Vendors were permitted at the festival, but only those who sold things that didn't need to be bought. One sold jars of sky memory, which turned out to be empty but labeled with dates. Another offered scarves knitted by people thinking about rain. The most popular stall gave away tea that smelled like the color gray. It had no official name, only a sign that read, "This might be what peace tastes like, or not." Musicians sometimes brought harps or flutes, but rarely played them. One group became known for tuning their instruments, then packing them up again, satisfied that the potential for music was enough. Children participated by being quietly curious. They asked questions like, "Do clouds get lonely?" Or, "What if a cloud is just the sky's way of thinking?" Adults answered with phrases like, "Maybe," or "Let's see what the wind says." Games were invented that had no winners, such as stare at the same cloud until it changes or you do, and name that shape, but only if you feel like it. Laughter, when it happened, came in soft bursts, like bubbles that knew not to pop too loudly. Over the years, the festival acquired small traditions. Someone would always read the Ode to the Nondescript, a poem attributed to no one and rephrased every year. One line remained constant, "Let what passes passed gently. Kites were flown, but only in slow arcs, and sometimes not even into the wind. People brought sketches of clouds they remembered from childhood. A man once brought a painting of a cloud he had only dreamed of, and everyone agreed it felt familiar. The weather was never predictable, which was seen as part of the charm. Sometimes the clouds would part, revealing a rude burst of sunlight. Attendees would shield their eyes and mumble, "Too decisive." Other years, it would rain, and people would simply raise their faces and whisper, "They're speaking." Umbrellas were allowed, but only in muted colors, and only if they were slightly broken. One year, no clouds appeared at all. The sky was perfectly blue. The festival still took place. People stared at the blue and imagined the clouds behind it, or ahead of it, or inside themselves. The absence, one attendee said, is part of the presence. The king often used the festival as a time to not reflect. He brought no thoughts, no plans, no messages. He once lay so still in the grass that a pigeon rested briefly on his shoulder. When asked later what he had been thinking, he replied, "Nothing yet." Those two words became the motto unofficially embroidered into the hems of festival blankets. The slightly melancholy Festival of Clouds became one of the few cultural exports of the kingdom. Other lands tried to replicate it, but often failed by trying too hard. "We shall honor your tradition," one ambassador said, organizing a cloud parade with floats and marching bands. Kingboard sent back a polite letter that read, "Thank you, but clouds do not march, they drift." Eventually, those wishing to experience the true festival made the journey to the quiet hills outside the capital, where nothing much was prepared, and everything felt intentional. No awards were given, no records were broken. Yet the festival was marked by a kind of emotional reset. People reported sleeping better afterward. Conflicts seemed smaller, lists grew shorter. A sense of soft attachment, not apathy, but serenity, lingered in the days that followed. It was said that the festival didn't celebrate clouds so much as become one. For a few gentle hours, the entire kingdom floated a little above its worries, uncertain of its shape, but confident in its softness. And so, each year, when the sky hesitated into gray, when the breeze forgot its direction, and when the fields whispered, "Now would be a lovely time," the people of King Board's realm gathered not to celebrate what was, but to dwell briefly in what might be a moment unclaimed, an atmosphere undecided, a kingdom so at peace it trusted even its festivals to be unfinished. Long before King Board III came to power, before the rise of the Snail Parliament and the Festival of Clouds, the people of his kingdom had already cultivated an extraordinary gift for underachievement in motion. Nowhere was this more evident than in the creation and celebration of the nation's official sport, still point. Not many outside the kingdom had heard of it. Fewer still understood it, and yet, for reasons both mysterious and profoundly boring, it had become the most widely observed and passionately not shared pastime in the land. The rules of still point were deceptively simple. Two players would sit on opposing cushions across a slightly uneven wooden table, staring at a single pebble placed precisely in the center. They could not touch the pebble, they could not speak, they could not blink too quickly or breathe too heavily, lest it be interpreted as provocation. The objective, though never stated clearly, was to do nothing with greater calm than the opponent. Matches could last for minutes, hours, occasionally days, and in one infamous case, an entire lunar cycle. The winner was never declared. Spectators simply sensed, at some indeterminate moment, that one player had subtly prevailed. The crowd, if present, would hum in collective agreement and slowly shuffle away. No scoreboards, no trophies, just mutual acknowledgement of having outstilled the other. It was said that King Board had once been a formidable still-point player in his youth. A local farmer swore he saw the then prince sit so still during a village tournament that a small bird mistook his head for a branch. The prince didn't flinch. The bird stayed until sunset. The opponent, unnerved, stood up to scratch his ankle, and was immediately considered spiritually defeated. That match was commemorated in song. which consisted mostly of 3 prolonged notes and the sound of a distant kettle boiling. Still point required no physical training, though many players underwent extensive untraining. They practiced anti-reflexes, reaction suppression, and the ancient art of selective zoning out. Some schools of still point philosophy taught the stare of gentle disinterest, others emphasized presence without intention. The best players, it was said, did not play at all, but became environments where the game simply happened around them. One grandmother, when asked about his strategy, replied, "I like to feel like furniture," but with slightly more dignity. Matches were often held in meadows, abandoned gazebos, or large, silent rooms with uneven lighting. Spectators brought cushions, tepid tea, and knitting projects they never intended to finish. Commentators, when employed, whispered vague remarks like, "She's doing nothing with impressive commitment," or "You can feel the absence of momentum." The national still point finals were broadcast annually via slow-sketching local artists rendering the match in real time using charcoal and lots of empty space. Listeners tuned into the accompanying radio coverage, which consisted mostly of long pauses and the occasional cough. Foreign visitors were baffled. Is this a sport or a shared nap? One ambassador asked, watching two competitors not move for 43 minutes. Yes, replied a nearby villager, beaming. Some outsiders mocked the game until they tried to play it. One overenthusiastic athlete from a neighboring kingdom sat down for his first still point match and accidentally won in under a minute by sneezing. Too aggressive, the judges said. Far too kinetic, he returned home humiliated, and later wrote a novel called Losing to Stillness. Despite its uneventfulness, or perhaps because of it, still point had a dedicated fan base. Children were introduced to it in school with quiet staring contests called practice gazes. Seniors played in parks, claiming it helped their joints by avoiding all use of them. Entire communities scheduled weekly still point sessions under the full moon, sharing subtle expressions and leaving with no clear idea of who was best, only that something vaguely meaningful had transpired. Occasionally, controversy would arise. One player scratched his nose mid-match and sparked a national debate. Was it involuntary? Was it a sign of defeat? Was it, perhaps, an advanced still point strategy designed to lull the opponent into complacency? Academics debated the incident for years. A symposium titled The Nose Scratch Doctrine was held at the Royal Academy, where professors from 4 departments gathered to examine frame-by-frame sketches of the moment. The final consensus: it happened, and now we must live with it. King Board encouraged the spread of still point, but refused to formalize it. Let it remain obscure, he once said, so that the clarity belongs only to those who don't need it. He attended matches not as a patron, but as a fellow observer, often sitting among the crowd, indistinguishable from any other wool-clad elder humming quietly to himself. Once, when asked who he believed the greatest player of all time was, he replied, "I forget their name," which proves their greatness. There were no official rankings, but every village claimed to have someone quietly legendary. A woman named Glinda was rumored to have won 5 matches in a row by blinking once every 10 minutes. A baker named Tobble was said to enter such deep states of motionless mindfulness that leaves refused to fall near him. There was even a retired postman known only as the Absence, who no one had seen for years, but whose reputation remained unshakably average. His alleged strategy, unremarkability so profound it becomes nearly mythic, still point began influencing other areas of life. Negotiations between farmers slowed to a single raised eyebrow per week. Artists began creating pieces titled incomplete on purpose. One orchestra premiered a silent symphony, performed by musicians miming their instruments, while the audience wept quietly. Fashion designers embraced beige, garments with no seams, and sleeves that slightly whispered when folded. The Postal Service introduced a maybe later stamp, used for letters that may never be sent. Productivity, by some metrics, declined. Satisfaction, by nearly all measures, increased. There were murmurs that the kingdom should compete internationally. King Board refused. Let the world remain puzzled by our sport, he said. To explain it would be to miss it. Instead, he proposed an alternative, a yearly not quite invitational, where no one was officially invited, but anyone who felt gently compelled could attend. The event was held in a damp field. 17 people showed up. No matches occurred. It was considered a resounding success, and so Still Point endured, not as a competition, but as a slow shared experience, as a moment stretched like wool between two thoughts, as a kingdom's quiet answer to the noisy insistence of the world. In a time when everyone else was rushing to define greatness through action, Kingboard's people had instead mastered the subtle nobility of deliberate non-doing. The pebble remained in the middle, the cushion softened, and the gaze, ever gentle, continued. There was a time, early in the reign of King Board III, when the royal court decided they needed a philosopher, not for policy, or truth, or even guidance, but simply because the library had an empty chair and someone thought it would look distinguished if that chair was occasionally occupied by a thinker who said things slowly. So they posted a notice: philosopher wanted? Must enjoy ambiguity. Preference given to those who have forgotten what they originally set out to say, and so arrived Quom Ponderby, a man who never walked in a straight line, wore robes that trailed slightly too long, and spoke as if each word was a trial balloon released into a very cautious sky. Quom never introduced himself directly. Instead, he wandered into the palace gardens during lunch one day, sat beneath a mossy arch, and asked no one in particular, if time forgets itself, do we age in reverse or simply softer? Everyone looked at him for a long time. No one answered, but someone handed him a biscuit, and from that moment onward, it was accepted that the philosopher had arrived. He never held an official title. Instead, he accumulated unofficial descriptions. The man of half-thoughts, the sage of circular sentences, the murmurer in residence. He did not publish books, preferring to write questions on fallen leaves and let the wind decide who found them. Gardeners frequently discovered fragments of his thinking while pruning. Can silence be folded? What shape does boredom take when it sits too long? If you fall asleep in the middle of your own sentence, is that still a conclusion? King Board adored him instantly. They would spend hours not quite talking, sharing partial ideas, interrupted metaphors, and long pauses thick with mutual understanding. One conversation reportedly went like this: King, do you believe in meaning? Quom, only if it arrives unannounced. King, and purpose. Quom, occasionally, but never early in the day. They then sat in contemplative silence for 43 minutes, during which the king nodded 3 times, and Quom drew a circle in the dirt and erased it slowly. Quom was never asked to speak in court, but he often did, just not at the appropriate times. In the middle of a debate about trade routes, he once whispered, "What if distance is just shy familiarity?" No one responded. Later, a council member wrote it down and used it to explain why tariffs made him nervous. His words rarely made sense immediately. They arrived like soft echoes, only understood after several days of indirect reflection. He's like thunder without lightning, one noble said. You're not sure what happened, but you feel slightly changed afterward. Children loved Quom. He taught philosophy to them in the form of riddles that didn't have answers. What color is a Tuesday when it forgets to hurry? He'd ask, and the children would giggle, not because they knew the answer, but because he didn't seem to expect one. He once led a class where the only assignment was to spend 20 minutes wondering whether their shadows had opinions. A 10-year-old turned in a drawing of a frowning silhouette and was awarded a ribbon that read probably profound. The philosopher refused to sit in chairs properly. He'd perch sideways, hang his legs over one armrest, or sit on the floor, beside the chair, explaining that seats should not dictate posture, only encourage interpretation. He once gave an entire talk while lying beneath a table. The audience lay down too. No one remembered what he said, but many described feeling pleasantly unsettled. His living quarters were exactly as expected, filled with unsorted scrolls, bowls containing single buttons, and shelves that held nothing but air. He once claimed he was collecting untouched space and had almost a full shelf's worth. When asked to describe his philosophy in one sentence, he responded, "That's the one thing I've never quite been able to do entirely and completely." He distrusted straight lines, claiming they gave people a false sense of destination. Maps confused him. He once got lost on his way to the palace kitchen and ended up delivering a spontaneous lecture to a broom cupboard, which several passing servants described as the most enlightening confusion of their lives. He eventually reached the kitchen, but forgot what he wanted and stood near the soup for 20 minutes, murmuring, "Smell is memory's way of bending." His influence began to grow quietly. The palace garden was redesigned to include only winding paths. Official documents started including optional footnotes that simply said, "But what if the opposite is also soothing?" A law was proposed, though never passed nor rejected, that would declare all firm opinions subject to scheduled uncertainty. The kingdom became a place where questions were not things to be solved, but shared like tea, gently, patiently, and preferably without milk. Visitors from abroad found Quom baffling. One scholar asked for his views on logic. Quom replied, "I once chased a thought so precisely that it turned into mist." Another demanded clarity on ethics, to which Quom responded, "Sometimes goodness is just not interrupting a sunset." Frustrated, they returned home, having learned nothing except how to hum while uncertain. The king once asked Quom if he was happy. Quom paused, tilted his head, and said, "I'm rarely not." That phrase became embroidered onto handkerchiefs, and later, a popular lullaby. His sayings became part of the language, used when people needed to explain how they felt, but didn't quite have the energy to articulate it. "I'm having a Quom day," someone might say, which meant they were thinking deeply about nothing in particular and enjoying it. Eventually, as all philosophers do, Quom became even more abstract. He stopped appearing regularly. The reports of him kept drifting in, seen napping beside fountains, sketching invisible diagrams in fog, or giving lectures to trees. Some said he was still writing, but in forms invisible to the eye, whispers, trapped in pockets of wind, thoughts folded into the way grass bent underfoot. No formal farewell was ever given. One morning, the palace chair meant for the philosopher was simply empty. A small slip of paper was found beneath it, reading, "Have I arrived elsewhere? Or is this the part where meaning goes for a walk?" The king, upon reading it, nodded, and went back to sipping his tea. And thus the royal philosopher who refused to think in straight lines was remembered not through books or doctrines or definitions, but through the gentle way people paused mid-sentence, tilted their heads, and allowed ambiguity to breathe a little more easily. He became not a legacy, but a lingering, a kind of thoughtful weather in the minds of a kingdom that had learned, under King Bord's reign, that clarity was overrated and that wandering without arriving was sometimes the wisest path of all. The kingdom of King Bord III was known for many things: long pauses mistaken for thought, festivals that celebrated vague atmospheres, sports that celebrated stillness, and a monarch who ruled chiefly by waiting. But among all its tranquil institutions, none was as quietly beloved, bafflingly comprehensive, or persistently apologetic as the official royal apology department. It was founded, rather accidentally, on a Tuesday when someone tripped over a loose cobblestone in the palace courtyard. No one knew who placed the cobblestone there, or how long it had been slightly crooked. A passerby, feeling vaguely responsible for witnessing the incident, said, "I'm terribly sorry," on behalf of whomever, and walked away. The person who tripped said, "Thank you, that feels official somehow." By sunset, the apology department had been born. At first, it was just one person, Mrs. Mildred Clough, sitting behind a desk with a small bell and a very large inkwell. She wore a beige cardigan that looked perpetually unsure of itself and had perfected the tone of voice that hovered somewhere between regret and reassurance. She began drafting apology letters for all manner of events: delayed rainstorms, underwhelming sunsets, moderately disappointing soup. These letters were not sent to specific recipients. They were posted publicly on cork boards across the kingdom. People would stop to read them and nod solemnly. Some would sigh, others would whisper, "That's fair." The apology department grew slowly but steadily. More staff were hired, quiet individuals with empathetic posture and handwriting that conveyed sincerity without drama. Their job was to write apologies for nearly everything that went mildly wrong, nearly happened, or probably never would. They issued formal statements on behalf of the wind for messing up people's hair. They apologized for echoes that repeated embarrassing phrases. They wrote a 10-page letter expressing regret that the moon had seemed a little off last Tuesday. The moon, if it read it, gave no response. This was considered polite. Their most popular apology was one issued every year to those who feel slightly behind. It did not mention behind what, or in comparison to whom. It simply read, "We recognize your pace. It is enough." Copies of this letter were hung in kitchens, tucked into lunchboxes, and once engraved on a bench in a park where no one was ever in a hurry. The department took its work seriously, but never severely. They believed in the power of almost sincerity, not because they didn't care, but because they cared gently. One memo stated, "We prefer to be approximately correct in feeling rather than aggressively precise in blame." Their apologies were never scathing, never legalistic. They never used the word liability. Instead, they favored phrases like regretful adjacency, emotional oops, and spiritual oversight. Their headquarters, located in a repurposed bakery, smelled faintly of flour and melancholy. The walls were lined with apology archives, shelves of parchment gently curling at the edges, each letter labeled by feeling rather than subject. There was a shelf for apologies with rain involved, another for apologies to things that don't technically have feelings but might. One whole section was devoted to premature farewells. The staff moved slowly, spoke softly, and considered sighing a legitimate form of punctuation. One day, a traveling scholar visited the apology department and asked, "Why apologize for such small things?" The director, a man named Pevin with a forehead like an overcast sky, replied, "Because most injuries are made of small things, and most peace begins where people feel seen, even slightly." The scholar blinked, wrote that down, and eventually turned it into a lecture that no one understood, but everyone applauded quietly. The department's fame began to spread. Not because they wanted it to, but because people began forwarding their letters, copying them by hand, and even reading them aloud at social gatherings. One noble began each dinner party with a ceremonial reading of apology for the loudness of cutlery, which made guests feel both amused and unusually calm. Another town printed the entire statement regarding the unfortunate texture of certain blankets on the side of its post office. This led to a short-lived blanket boycott, which resolved itself when everyone admitted they were just being dramatic. Yet, for all its willingness to apologize for things as trivial as overripe pears and vaguely unfriendly shadows, the department had one peculiar policy: it never apologized for itself. Repeated requests from the public, always polite, usually phrased as "it would be lovely if you acknowledged your own occasional over-apology," were met with a short but firm response: "We are not yet prepared to issue a statement regarding our own necessity. Thank you for your patience." Some suspected this was a philosophical stance. Others believed it was an elaborate performance of bureaucratic irony. One child theorized, "Maybe they're just waiting for the perfect apology, and it hasn't arrived yet." Everyone agreed this was the best possible explanation. Even the king, known for his love of all things vaguely purposeless, once asked, "Do you think they'll ever apologize for being so good at apologizing?" His advisor replied, "That may cause an ontological loop." The king nodded and went back to stirring his tea in a counterclockwise fashion, which he believed prevented ideological spirals. Despite their silence on their own existence, the department's influence was everywhere. Public signage adopted their tone. Instead of "no entry," doors now read, "We regret this path is not available today." Instead of "Do not touch," museum placards said, "We apologize, but this object prefers observation over interaction." Even the military, such as it was, changed its recruitment slogan from "Serve with pride" to "We're sorry to trouble you, but we'd be grateful for your consideration." Critics existed, as they always do. One newspaper columnist wrote a scathing piece titled, "Enough with the sorries," claiming the department was enabling passivity. In response, the department issued a letter titled, "Apology for any emotional fatigue caused by our frequency," which softened the critic's tone considerably. He later published a follow-up titled, "Actually, I feel slightly better." Perhaps the most poignant moment in the department's history came during a year of exceptional calm. Nothing much went wrong. The weather was mild, people were content. The clouds behaved themselves. The department, facing a lack of events to respond to, issued a letter titled, "Apology for not being needed recently." It was met with widespread affection. That, said one villager, holding back a yawn, was the most beautiful thing they never had to write. And so the official royal apology department continued, not with fanfare, but with soft paper, slower ink, and the belief that sometimes the gentlest thing you can do for someone is to say, "Yes, that felt off," and we noticed. In the quiet southern hills of King Board III's kingdom, just past a winding path that almost looked deliberate but wasn't quite sure of itself, there stood a monument, an impressive stone structure that curved gently like an apologetic question mark and shimmered faintly in the late afternoon light. It was neither grand nor small, neither solemn nor celebratory. It was, in most respects, a monument to nothing in particular, and yet everyone agreed it was very clearly a monument to forgetfulness. Why? No one remembered exactly. It had no plaque, no inscription, no date, no known architect. The only thing people seemed certain of was that they had forgotten why it was there, and somehow that made perfect sense. Scholars tried for years to determine the origin of the monument. Some believed it was built to commemorate a long-lost battle that was never actually fought. Others claimed it honored an important person whose name had been misplaced during a particularly dull census. Still others were convinced that it was once a fountain, or perhaps the ruins of an idea that had gotten halfway to being useful and then fallen asleep. A few insisted it was the work of the royal philosopher, Quam Ponderby, who once famously said, "If we can't remember why we're gathering, perhaps we've gathered for the right reason." But when asked if he designed the monument, Quam simply looked up at the sky and said, "Ah, was that a Tuesday?" Regardless of its mysterious origins, the monument to forgetfulness became a strangely popular destination. People made slow pilgrimages there, carrying half-remembered stories, unmailed letters, and socks that no longer had pairs. They didn't come to pay respect or mourn. They came to feel the peculiar comfort of not knowing something and being okay with it. "It's like visiting a gentle shrug," one visitor said, sitting on the cool stone and staring into the distance without any particular focus. The monument itself was made of a kind of stone that seemed to forget its own shape. From some angles, it looked like a spiral; from others, a reclining figure; from others still, it resembled a half-melted loaf of bread left on a philosopher's windowsill. Its surface was smooth in places, rough in others, and entirely inconsistent. When touched, it felt slightly cooler than expected, like a memory returning out of order. Children liked to press their cheeks to it and say things like, "It smells like dreams you forgot to write down." Adults, more reserved, simply nodded and muttered, "Yes, exactly." Each year, without any official planning, people gathered at the monument on a day no one could remember choosing. They brought forgotten things, unread books, birthday cards never sent, promises they meant to keep but somehow misplaced. These items were left at the base of the structure, not as offerings, but as gentle acknowledgments of their own impermanence. The wind often carried them away, or they simply vanished, which felt appropriate. "It's not litter," one villager said. its memory returning to the mist. One year, a group of well-meaning historians attempted to establish the monument's origin definitively. They arrived with notebooks, instruments, and determined facial expressions. After 3 weeks of careful observation, soil analysis, and a great deal of thoughtful frowning, they published a paper titled, "It was probably built, but not urgently." The paper was later misplaced. The historians did not return. The king himself visited the monument only once, though he never spoke of it afterward. Witnesses reported that he arrived alone, carrying a small, dusty box. He sat beside the monument for several hours, opened the box, looked inside, nodded once, and then closed it again. When asked later what was in the box, he replied, "Something I no longer need to recall." The box was never seen again, nor was the blanket he brought with him, which some say became part of the stone itself, folded into the surface like a sigh. Poets found the monument inspiring in a way they couldn't explain. They wrote verses with no titles, rhymes that refused to resolve, and stanzas that trailed off mid-thought. One particularly popular poem ended with the line, "and then, perhaps, it," followed by an intentional blank space. It was read aloud every year at the Nong ceremony held around the monument, where people sat in loose circles and spoke fondly of things they couldn't quite recall. No one was required to attend. Everyone who came believed they had stumbled upon it by accident. The monument's most curious feature was its ability to make people feel oddly lighter, not in the body, but in the mind. Visitors often reported a sense of gentle relief, as if something they'd been carrying had quietly excused itself from their thoughts. "It's like a nap I didn't know I needed," said one merchant, who returned every year to forget his business goals. Another woman claimed she once arrived in tears, forgot why, and left humming an unfamiliar lullaby. No one found this strange. In fact, it was considered a sign that the monument was working. It was never defaced. No graffiti, no vandalism, no angry chisel marks. Perhaps no one could remember why they were upset long enough to do anything about it. Even pigeons respected it, choosing instead to roost nearby but never directly on the stone. Some believed it emitted a frequency of mild forgetfulness that discouraged interruption. A local scientist attempted to measure this, but misplaced his notes and later confessed, "I think I was studying something meaningful, or maybe it was marmalade." He was given a polite round of applause and a lukewarm cup of tea. A few skeptics insisted the monument was a meaningless lump of rock, a fluke of erosion. But even they, when pressed, admitted that it had a certain agreeable amnesia. One skeptic was seen hugging it softly one evening, whispering, "Just let me forget the name of that embarrassing horse." As the years went on, no effort was made to restore, clean, or catalog the monument. It withered naturally, slowly, gently, like the wearing away of a memory you no longer mind losing. New moss would grow where old lichen had faded. Cracks would appear and be accepted. It became less a structure and more an atmosphere, a presence without urgency, a destination that demanded nothing and gave only absence in return. And so it remained, the monument to forgetfulness, unclaimed and uncared for in the most loving possible way. It stood not as a tribute to failure, nor as a rejection of the past, but as a quiet affirmation that forgetting could be sacred. That some things, perhaps many things, deserve to be released from the tyranny of recall, that not all meaning lay in preservation, but sometimes in letting the fog roll gently over what once seemed important. To this day, no one knows who built it, no name is etched, no memory holds the answer, and no one seems troubled by that fact. In a kingdom that cherished the unhurried and the unfinished, the forgotten monument stood not as a mystery to be solved, but as a peace to be entered, and those who visited, whether intentionally or not, often left behind something they hadn't realized they were ready to let go of. One evening, somewhere deep into the reign of King Board III, long past the era of still point tournaments, apology festivals, and meandering thoughts that occasionally became public policy. The stars simply forgot to show up on time. There was no announcement, no dramatic eclipse, no heavenly commotion. The sky dimmed in its usual sleepy manner, with the sun bowing out reluctantly behind the hills, and the villagers, as they often did, tilted their heads up in quiet expectation. But the stars, usually so punctual in their slow, glittery emergence, were absent, utterly, unmistakably not there. At first, no one said anything. After all, this was a kingdom that did not pride itself on immediacy. A delay was often viewed as an opportunity to contemplate slowness, or to notice the soft shape of things. Still, after a few long minutes of celestial nothingness, murmurs began. "Perhaps it's clouds," someone offered. "No," replied another. "The sky is to bear even for clouds. It looks like it forgot what clouds are." Some villagers consulted the royal weather almanac, which contained mostly illustrations of various yawns. Others just blinked up at the vast, blank dome and said, in a tone that could mean anything. The royal astronomer, a gentleman named Ludlow, who mostly napped in his observatory and drew circles in the dust, was gently woken and informed of the situation. He adjusted his slippers, looked through a telescope aimed at absolutely nothing, and concluded, "It appears the stars are late. Let's give them some time. Perhaps they got distracted." He then went back to sleep and later claimed to have dreamt of constellations playing chess with the moon. This report was filed under interesting if true. King Board himself was informed as he sat cross-legged on his balcony, sipping warm water with a slice of something that might once have been lemon. He looked up at the blank sky for a long moment, then simply said, "Let them arrive when they're ready. We are in no rush." He then resumed his quiet contemplation of a cloudless horizon, which he described as neither disappointing nor overly enthusiastic. Meanwhile, the kingdom adapted in its usual way, slowly, gently, and with profound patience. A poet on a rooftop paused mid-stanza, looked at the empty sky, and declared, "Perhaps tonight the stars are introspective." A group of children lay in the grass, trying to guess where the stars would be if they were on time. One child placed buttons in the grass in the shape of a theoretical constellation called the slightly confused owl. A baker, unable to sleep without starlight, began kneading dough in silence, humming a tune that didn't have a melody, but felt comforting all the same. Some proposed metaphysical explanations. A philosopher, possibly Quam Ponderby in disguise, muttered, "Maybe the stars are waiting for us to notice their absence before returning." Others believed the sky had simply forgotten its own job, and no one had reminded it. To be fair, one old man noted, "We've all forgotten our jobs at some point. Mine used to involve buttons." I think the apology department began drafting a statement, but abandoned it halfway through when someone suggested that maybe this was an apology from the stars, a slow, twinkling kind of "I need a moment." Instead of publishing the apology, they issued a long letter that read, "We acknowledge the pause." It was printed on translucent paper and promptly left on doorsteps, where it curled slightly and flew away, as if unsure of its own relevance. Around midnight, something strange began to happen. The sky, though still blank, started to feel full, not with stars, but with possibility. The absence had matured into a presence, a soft, expansive hush. Lovers stopped waiting for the stars and, instead, listened to each other breathe. Musicians played lullabies for no audience. An artist painted a canvas entirely black and titled it "They'll Be Here Soon." One village elder sat by her window, tea untouched, and said aloud, "It's nice, isn't it? A night that asks for nothing." Then, without warning, the stars began to arrive, not with a dramatic flourish or a cosmic trumpet blast, just a slow shimmer here, a shy flicker there, as though someone backstage had finally remembered to lift the curtain. One by one, the pinpricks of light reappeared. They didn't apologize or offer any explanation. They simply resumed being stars. The people did not cheer. They did not gasp. They simply nodded, as one might when a friend finally joins you on a bench without saying a word. "There you are," someone whispered. "Right on time, if you ask me," the children pointed, now unsure whether their imagined constellations had influenced the actual ones. "Look, the confused owl is real," a boy shouted, pointing at nothing in particular. No one corrected him. The king, still on his balcony, took one last sip of his lukewarm water, smiled softly, and said, "They've chosen elegance over punctuality. I admire that." Then he fell asleep with his crown resting sideways on his head and a blanket draped unevenly over his knees. A nearby guard took note of the moment and later titled it a sovereign sigh in his diary. The rest of the night passed. Quietly, the stars resumed their usual duties, twinkling just enough to remind people they existed, but not enough to be distracting. Wishes were whispered, mostly out of habit, and dreams drifted gently into the minds of those who had waited. Without needing to know why. By morning, the entire event was already fading into legend. Children recounted it as a magical star strike. Elders described it as the most peaceful protest they'd ever experienced. A carpenter began carving furniture inspired by the event: stools with missing legs, knit stands with drawers that refused to open, all titled with names like Late but Lovely and Almost Visible. No official record was made of the night the stars were late. No date was marked. But everyone remembered how it had made them feel, unhurried, unharmed, and strangely whole. In a world so often obsessed with arrival, it had been a night about waiting, about uncertainty, and about being completely fine with both. The stars had taken their time and no one had minded at all. Tucked between a hill that didn't try too hard and a road that forgot where it was going stood the Museum of Slightly Mysterious Things. It wasn't particularly tall, nor grand, nor even especially well marked. Most people didn't remember exactly how they'd arrived there, and no one ever remembered the first time they heard of it. But it had always been there, or so they said, in a building that looked like it might once have been a bakery, a courthouse, or perhaps a polite misunderstanding between architecture styles. The museum's sign simply read "Open Probably," and swung gently in the breeze with no particular urgency. Its door creaked in a friendly, apologetic way, as if to say, "You're welcome, even if you're not quite sure why you came." Inside, the Museum of Slightly Mysterious Things was a labyrinth of quiet corners, hesitant lighting, and soft displays that didn't demand attention so much as offer the suggestion of a glance. Each object on display had a small placard next to it, not explaining what it was, but suggesting how it might be almost meaningful. One such placard read, "An unnamed key, possibly metaphorical, probably misplaced." Another, placed beside what looked like a melted spoon, offered, warped by neither fire nor time, but perhaps by indecision. The museum was curated not by a single person, but by a gentle committee that never met. Each member simply added items as they saw fit, leaving vague notes for one another like, "This might be important," or "I'm not sure what this is, but it felt curious." There was no official catalog. The museum's guidebook, if one found it, was mostly blank. Pages with occasional phrases like "See room with soft humming" or "Turn left at the lamp that seems to remember you." One visitor once followed the instructions to stand still and listen, and after doing so for 20 minutes, claimed to have heard the sound of a memory exiting quietly. One room in the museum contained nothing but chairs that seemed slightly too familiar. Visitors sat in them, looked around, and often whispered things like, "This reminds me of my aunt's house," or "May be a dream I had." Another room had mirrors that didn't reflect your face exactly, but some part of your mood. If you entered grumpy, you saw a version of yourself frowning in slow motion. If you arrived curious, your reflection occasionally winked back. "These are not mirrors," someone once said. "They're conversations." Perhaps the most famous room, if anything in the museum could be called famous, was the Hall of Unfinished Sentences. Along the walls were parchment scrolls with phrases like, "And then she said," and it was almost as if And you must understand, the thing about shadows is, people would stand and read these fragments, their minds filling in the blanks with their own ideas, until they began to forget where the sentence stopped and where their own thoughts began. One child reportedly completed every sentence aloud, then promptly fell asleep on the floor and dreamed in ellipses. The museum had a soft soundscape, a combination of murmured voices, slow clocks, and occasional wind chimes. Though no one had ever located a single wind chime, the air smelled faintly of old books, warm dust, and something that might have once been vanilla. Candles flickered in some rooms even though they were not lit. The temperature adjusted to one's mood, which meant that groups rarely agreed on whether it was too warm or slightly melancholic. Visitors left notes, not in a guest book, but tucked between exhibits, slipped under doorframes, or folded into the pockets of jackets hanging by the entrance, none of which belonged to anyone anymore. These notes often read, "Thank you for the feeling I almost remembered," or "This helped me forget something gently," or simply, "I don't know what this was, but it mattered in a very quiet way." The staff, if they could be called that, never collected these notes. They allowed them to gather, drift, settle, and fade, just as the exhibits themselves often did. Some displays disappeared entirely. A lamp that hummed softly in the corner one day would be gone the next, replaced by a cracked teacup labeled "Used to understand something." No one complained. In fact, many visitors came specifically to see what wasn't there anymore. A librarian described the museum as a place where absence is curated with love. A philosopher, trying to explain the museum's significance, paused mid-sentence and simply pointed at a doorknob that didn't seem attached to any door. King Board III once visited the museum, though his presence was never officially recorded. According to rumors, and this was as close to official documentation as the museum ever got, he arrived alone, carrying a box labeled "Maybe Important." He wandered the halls slowly, nodding at displays, occasionally muttering, "Hem," with regal softness. He spent over an hour in the room of forgotten purposes, which contained a desk, a feather, a stone shaped like a question mark, and a half-finished list titled "Things to Eventually Consider." Before he left, he placed the box on a shelf, with no label, took a deep breath, and whispered, "That feels better." The box was never opened. Some believe it's still there, though no one has confirmed which shelf. Children especially loved the museum. They treated it like a dream you could walk through. One little girl brought her imaginary friend and insisted that he found a cousin in the mirror room. Another boy spent an entire afternoon speaking to a painting of a door, claiming it responded with advice on how to be slightly less loud inside your own head. No one corrected him. A teacher accompanying a school group once entered the museum feeling stressed and exited wondering why he had been stressed at all. "It's like the building exhaled into my brain," he wrote later, on the back of a napkin. Of course not everyone appreciated the museum. A critic once wrote a very stern review titled "A Waste of Uncertainty." In it, he complained that nothing was labeled properly, that the lighting was emotionally unhelpful, and that he left more confused than when he entered. The museum staff, if they heard of this, simply added his review to a wall titled "Things We're Still Thinking About." The review eventually faded, as most things did, and was replaced by a sketch of a balloon floating away from a string. No one truly knows who started the Museum of Slightly Mysterious Things. Some say it began as a collection of personal memories misplaced at a train station. Others believe it was always there, gradually assembling itself from leftover meaning. One theory suggests that every object in the museum is something someone let go of too gently to be lost entirely. Whatever the truth, the museum remains not frozen in time, but gently swaying with it. People who visit rarely come looking for answers. Instead, they leave with questions they didn't know they had, or clarity they never expected, and when they step back into the world, blinking softly in the daylight, they often find themselves speaking slower, listening more, and wondering what other slightly mysterious things they might have overlooked along the way. Every year, on the third Thursday after the second fog of early mid-late spring, weather permitting. Of course, the entire kingdom of King Board III came together to celebrate its most important holiday. The day was marked on no calendar, announced by no trumpet, and dictated by no decree. Yet, without fail, people knew when it had arrived. The morning air would carry a slight scent of overripe pears and old ideas. The crows would caw in a pattern that sounded vaguely ceremonial. Shopkeepers would open their doors half an hour later than usual, not because they had to, but because it simply felt appropriate. It was, quite unmistakably, the day of unspecified significance. No one could remember when the tradition began. Some said it dated back to the kingdom's founding. Others claimed it was invented by a baker who once forgot to finish a sentence and accidentally created a movement. A few old scholars insisted it was originally a religious observance, though none could agree on what was being revered. One theory posited that the holiday was meant to celebrate the concept of celebration itself. Another suggested it was a collective pause for people to consider things they might have considered if they hadn't been distracted by other, louder obligations. Regardless of its origins, the day had become the most universally acknowledged non-specific event in the kingdom's calendar that -WES and single quotes T-really-a-calendar. Preparation for the holiday was both elaborate and non-existent. Some people decorated their homes with twine and leaves, others with clocks set to the wrong time. Many simply placed an object of ambiguous importance in the center of their living room, such as a single boot, a cracked teacup, or a painting turned backward, and stared at it thoughtfully. No one asked why. That would have been rude. Children loved the holiday, mostly because they were encouraged to wear their clothes inside out, invent games with no rules, and address adults only in rhyming questions. One child asked his grandmother, "Why do we honor what we can't define?" To which she replied, "Because clarity is terribly overrated, dear." That response was later embroidered on a cushion and placed in the town library's least visited reading nook. There were no official meals associated with the day, but tradition held that everyone should consume something that confused their tongue. This led to dishes like warm lemonade stew, pickled shortbread, and toast spread with philosophical uncertainty, which turned out to be mashed bananas with nutmeg, renamed for effect. Street vendors sold edible clouds, cotton candy shaped like thoughts you forgot mid-sentence, and drinks labeled only as perhaps. One cup was described as tasting like a memory of vanilla that got interrupted. At noon, a bell would ring somewhere no one knew exactly where, and people would stop whatever they were doing and perform a group gesture called the slight acknowledgement. This involved raising one eyebrow, shifting your weight to the left, and sighing just loudly enough for someone nearby to notice but not comment. Tourists often got it wrong, attempting full bows or exaggerated salutes. Locals were forgiving. The effort matters more than the execution, they would say, which was, in many ways, the unofficial motto of the holiday. In the town square, a stage was sometimes set up for performances that didn't quite happen. A man with a cello would appear and spend 40 minutes tuning it without playing a single note. A group of dancers would move in slow motion toward a conclusion that never arrived. One year, a playwright stood on stage, opened his script to page 1, looked out at the audience, and said, "You already know how this ends." Then he closed the book and walked away to mild applause. The performance was later described as emotionally ambiguous in a refreshing way. King Board III always participated, though in characteristically understated fashion. He would sit in the palace courtyard wearing a hat that may or may not have been upside down, and greet passers-by with the phrase, "Ah yes, this again," regardless of whether he recognized them. Once, he released a royal proclamation written entirely in parentheses. It read, "We the undersigned do hereby affirm our commitment to commemorating that, which we are not entirely sure about, in the spirit of whatever it is this is meant to be." The parchment was hung in the royal waiting room and promptly forgotten, which was widely considered the most appropriate outcome. Perhaps the most anticipated tradition was the annual procession of possibly important things. Villagers would parade through the streets carrying items whose significance was unknown but deeply felt. One woman marched with a broken clock, insisting it still told the right time in spirit. A boy carried a rock shaped like a thought bubble. Someone once brought a shoe full of marbles and explained, it just seemed necessary. The procession ended at the edge of the river, where the items were not thrown away, but rather arranged into a kind of altar of ambiguity. Some items remained for years, growing moss, others vanished overnight. No one questioned either result. In the evening, people gathered in candle-lit rooms or beneath trees that hummed slightly in the wind. They took turns sharing vaguely meaningful statements, which were not stories, not speeches, but something in between. A popular example included, "I once nearly decided to become someone else, but then I misplaced the paperwork." Another favorite was, "I'm not sure if I've been here before, or if I've just been thinking about it long enough to believe I have." These were received with nods, sighs, and the occasional knowing murmur of him. As night settled in, the kingdom grew quieter, softer, as if even the grass was unsure whether it was supposed to be celebrating. Fireflies blinked with no pattern. The stars, hopefully on time this year, appeared one by one, without fanfare. The people of the kingdom, wrapped in shawls and half-memories, looked up and whispered things they wouldn't remember in the morning. It was tradition, after all. And then, just before midnight, anyone would declare, "It's time," though no one ever clarified what it was time for. People would smile at this, exchange vague affirmations, and begin the slow shuffle home. Doors were closed, candles extinguished, and the day folded itself quietly into the collective subconscious. By the next morning, the holiday was over, though it was hard to say exactly what had ended. People resumed their usual pace, slow, thoughtful, and full of polite speculation. No decorations were taken down, because none had truly gone up. No leftovers were eaten, because no one quite knew what they had prepared. The only trace left behind was a feeling of having participated in something gently unimportant, yet profoundly pleasant. And so the day of unspecified significance lived on year after year, moment after moment, not as a grand tradition or national pride, but as a celebration of the almost remembered, the not quite defined, and the beautifully unclear. It was, after all, the kingdom's most important holiday, and no one could explain why. In the very center of the capital stood the royal clock tower, a tall, somewhat wobbly structure made of stone, mild ambition, and the faint memory of punctuality. It was considered a monument to the kingdom's relationship with time, which is to say, it existed, but only loosely. The clock itself, an ornate affair with hands shaped like sleepy arrows and numerals that occasionally faded in and out of view, had been ticking steadily for as long as anyone could remember, though not always at the same speed. Some days it ran early by a few minutes. Other days it paused for tea. No one minded. The royal clock was considered more a suggestion than a measurement. Still, it was there, faithfully, turning time into soft chimes that echoed politely over the rooftops. Then, one Wednesday that might have been a Thursday, the clock simply stopped. Its great mechanism, usually groaning and creaking with the rhythm of old purpose, fell silent. The minute hand hovered gently between 7 and 8. The hour hand pointed toward what might have been mid-morning, or perhaps late contentment. The pendulum, once slow and graceful, came to rest like a sigh. Birds perched upon it without concern, a cat napped beneath it without drama. The tower stood, as it always had, but now it stood still, word spread slowly, as most things did in King Board III's realm. A passing tailor looked up, furrowed his brow ever so slightly, and said, A postman checked his watch, saw that it disagreed with the tower, and shrugged with impressive elegance. At the palace, the royal timekeeper, a man known simply as Mr. Possibly, was informed while in the middle of arranging his sand collection. He squinted at the message, nodded once, and said, "Ah, so it's that kind of day." Curiously, nothing changed. Shops opened and closed at their usual intervals. Give or take a philosophical pause, farmers continued to coax crops from the soil with soft humming and mild curiosity. The baker made bread at precisely the moment it felt necessary. School children attended lessons, though one clever girl asked whether history was still happening. If the clock had stopped, her teacher responded by opening a book titled Yes and also No, and reading the introduction 3 times without turning the page. The king, upon hearing the news, did not react immediately. He finished his tea, arranged 3 pebbles into a pleasing triangle, and walked to the clock tower himself. A small crowd had gathered not out of alarm, but out of shared observation. One man held up a pocket watch and declared, "It's still today." A woman whispered, "I thought time felt a bit softer than usual." The king gazed up at the frozen hands of the clock, then gently placed his own hand over his heart, as if to check whether something was still ticking. Apparently satisfied, he nodded and said, "Let it rest." And so they did. Rather than repair the clock, the people simply accepted its silence as part of the kingdom's rhythm. Mr. Possibly placed a small sign on the tower that read, "Temporarily permanent." Tourists took photos of the unmoving face and commented on its serenity. Philosophers held lectures beneath it with titles like The Metaphysics of Inaction and Chronos. Interrupted. One particularly inspired thinker declared the stopped clock to be the perfect metaphor for everything, then promptly forgot what he meant. Children began playing a game called Still a Clock, where they had to freeze whenever someone pointed at the tower. The winner was whoever forgot they were playing and wandered off most gracefully. Merchants adjusted their price signs to read as timeless as this bread and buy now. While moments last, a poet wrote, "The clock has stopped, but my thoughts continue at a reasonable pace." This was printed on mugs, napkins, and at least one umbrella. Interestingly, the weather seemed to take cues from the tower. Rain began falling more contemplatively. Sunlight lingered longer in the corners of rooms. The wind arrived slowly, as if it had paused outside to finish a thought before entering. Birds flew in less of a hurry. Even the river nearby, once described as moderately enthusiastic, adopted a more reflective flow. Fishermen reported that the fish were biting, but not urgently. Time, it seemed, had not disappeared, merely loosened. People began living by the feeling of moments rather than the measurement of them. Lunch occurred when stomachs agreed it should. Appointments began with the phrase, "Now seems good." Meetings ended when everyone had said enough. An artisan, once obsessed with deadlines, began crafting hourglasses that contained feathers. Instead of sand, they fall slowly, he explained, but always land when they're ready. Of course, a few concerned individuals did attempt to restart the clock. A team of mechanics climbed the tower, inspected the gears, and concluded that nothing was broken, just still. They tapped the pendulum gently. Nothing. They replaced the springs. Still nothing. Finally, they whispered kind encouragement to the mechanisms, promising it would be okay to move again. The gear shuddered ever so slightly, then returned to perfect stillness. The team descended the tower, shrugged, and decided to take the rest of the week off in its honor. The only one truly affected by the clock's silence was the royal alarmist, whose entire job was to panic in case of emergencies. He spent several days running in slow circles, waving papers with words like urgent and now, but no one seemed in the mood for urgency or nowness. Eventually, he sat at the base of the tower, folded one of his memos into a paper boat, and set it adrift in the public fountain. "There," he muttered, "crisis ... softly averted." After a month, or possibly several, depending on your measure, someone noticed that the clock had started again. No one knew exactly when. Its hands were turning, gently, as though returning from a long nap. The chimes resumed, not loudly, but with a sort of friendly confusion, like someone entering a room and forgetting why. A child pointed and said, "Look, it's awake," and everyone looked, smiled, and returned to what they had been doing. which was mostly nothing in particular. No announcement was made. No celebration held. Mr. Possibly quietly removed the temporarily permanent sign and replaced it with one that read, "Welcome back if you left." The king noted in his diary, "Time has resumed, though I hadn't noticed it had gone." The diary entry took up half a page and ended with a doodle of a sleeping turtle. And so, the royal clock ticked on, unburdened by its own importance. People still checked it now and then, but mostly out of politeness. What mattered was not the time it told, but the stillness it had offered, the gentle reminder that even in a world ruled by moments, sometimes the most meaningful thing time can do is pause. It was a cloudy morning in the late part of the early middle period of King Board III's reign when the kingdom gathered for what was rumored to be the most important speech the king had ever written. The sky was a soft, considerate gray. Birds chirped with indoor voices. The wind passed through the streets as if walking on tiptoe. Even the baker, whose bread was famously punctual, delayed the day's first loaf out of respect for the moment. Everyone felt it in their bones, or at least in their elbows, that something vaguely historic was about to happen. The king, who was not known for speeches, had spent the better part of 3 years writing this one. Or perhaps 1 year and 2 years of thoughtful staring. No one was entirely sure. What was known is that he had recently taken to pacing the palace halls with a notebook labeled possibly important words, occasionally murmuring phrases like, "Yes, but softer," or more truth, less punctuation. His royal staff had learned not to interrupt him during these moments, lest they be met with a slow blink and a sigh that sounded like a falling feather. On the morning of the speech, the Royal Assembly Hall was filled to comfortable not quite capacity. The chairs, slightly uneven on purpose, creaked in agreement. The audience included peasants, nobles, librarians, poets, to sheep accidentally invited but warmly welcomed, and at least one philosopher who had come mostly to see if a speech could be felt but not heard. Rumors buzzed softly that the king would speak about the meaning of the kingdom, or the shape of time, or possibly the true purpose of chairs. The last rumor was particularly popular with furniture makers. The king arrived exactly when he intended to, not a minute earlier or later. He wore a robe the color of dusk and a crown that tilted ever so slightly, not out of carelessness, but in perfect alignment with his general worldview. He stepped onto the dais, adjusted a stack of handwritten pages in front of him, and looked out at the crowd with a gaze that felt like both a question and its answer. Then he opened his mouth and spoke, or at least, that's what everyone assumed. Because no one heard a word, not a whisper, not a syllable, not a breath shaped into meaning. The king's mouth moved, his hands gestured with elegant precision, and his expression shifted with all the drama of a man revealing secrets to the universe. But not a single sound came out. At first, people thought it was a technical issue. The royal amplification device, a large brass horn powered by mild optimism, was checked. It was working, more or less. A nearby scribe tried to read the king's lips, but he only got as far as the before giving up and sketching a drawing of a thoughtful turnip instead. The sheep blinked slowly. A noble leaned over to a scholar and asked, "Is this part of it?" The scholar replied, "I hope so." 10 minutes passed. Then 15, then possibly 20, depending on your definition of time. The king continued his silent oration, undeterred. He turned pages, paused for effect, gestured upward as if inviting the clouds to consider something, and smiled at one point in a way that made a small boy in the back say, "I think I understand now." No one asked what he understood. It felt rude. The silence deepened, not into awkwardness, but into something far stranger, attentiveness. People began leaning forward, not to hear better, but to feel better. They watched the king's face, his hands, the rhythm of his breathing. They watched as he placed one hand gently on the podium and closed his eyes for exactly 3 seconds. It was the kind of moment you remember even if you don't know why. A poet in the third row wept quietly and later wrote, "He said nothing, and it was everything." A carpenter beside him nodded solemnly and carved the words "Speak in stillness" into the arm of his chair. A librarian closed her eyes and whispered, "This is what meaning sounds like before it becomes noise." Eventually, after what might have been the length of a short novel or a long nap, the king reached the final page. He looked out over the crowd one last time, folded his notes with deliberate care, and bowed low, slow, and full of something that wasn't quite sadness, wasn't quite joy, but something entirely dignified in its lack of explanation. And then he left. The crowd didn't applaud. Not because they weren't moved, but because clapping would have broken something delicate in the air. Instead, they sat in silence, letting the weight of what hadn't been said settle around them like a comfortable fog. One by one, people rose, nodded at each other as if sharing a secret, and drifted quietly back into the day. The king returned to his chambers and placed the folded speech into a drawer labeled just enough. When his attendant asked if he'd like to revise or publish it, the king smiled and said, "Oh no, it's already been heard." For weeks afterward, the kingdom moved a little slower, spoke a little softer. People paused more often, not out of forgetfulness, but intention. The baker began leaving small notes in his loaves that said things like, "You are exactly on time." The postman, who usually hummed tunelessly, began humming in minor chords. A painter added a blank canvas to his exhibition and titled it, "What the King Said." It received excellent reviews. Children asked their parents, "What did the king say?" To which the parents replied, "Listen again." A traveling bard attempted to recreate the moment using only gestures and long pauses, but was interrupted by applause far too early. He sighed, bowed, and said, "You've already missed it." This, ironically, became the most quoted line of the year. Eventually, the silence of the speech faded, not completely, but like the scent of something lovely that lingers in fabric. And though no one could quote a single word of it because, of course, there had been none, it became known across the land as the king's greatest speech. Not because it convinced anyone of anything, not because it declared a great truth, but because, for a few minutes, everyone had listened completely. And that, in a kingdom as comfortably distracted as theirs, was the rarest speech of all. And so, as the stars blinked gently overhead and the wind drapes itself across the hills like a forgetful storyteller, the tale of King Bord III quietly folds itself into the back pocket of history, a reign marked not by battles or banners, not by upheaval or ambition, but by a kind of thoughtful stillness like the space between notes in a lullaby. Nothing particularly grand ever happened, and that was, perhaps, the most grand thing of all. Under his rule, time forgot how to rush. People remembered how to listen. The days flowed one into the next like soft-spoken sentences in a long and meandering book. There were festivals with no cause, parades with no path, museums filled with ambiguity, and speeches carried only in silence. And through it all, the king sat not upon a throne of gold or glory, but on a slightly uneven cushion, with a cup of warm water in his hand and a question forever in his eyes. History, you see, is often obsessed with noise, conquest, conflict, crowns colliding. But in this quiet little kingdom, meaning bloomed in the margins, in the space between chores, in the sighs shared by strangers, in the way someone might pause beside a flower and wonder if it had anything to say. There were no monuments raised to King Bord, no grand statues carved from stone. Instead, people remembered him when they brewed tea just to hold the cup, when they walked slower on purpose, when they looked at the stars and thought, maybe they're a little late tonight, and that's perfectly all right. And now, as your own eyelids begin their slow descent, and the thoughts in your head start to wander away like drowsy sheep looking for a soft place to rest, perhaps you can feel a bit of the king's realm within you. That small kingdom where nothing urgent needs to happen, where clocks may stop and speeches go unheard, and still everything feels gently, wonderfully enough. So rest now. Let the world blur. Let the noise melt into nothing. Let the history of boredom lull you towards sleep like a long-forgotten lullaby hummed by time itself. For in this kingdom, the greatest events are the ones that let you drift away, undisturbed, unburdened, and beautifully bored. Good night, and welcome to the dream.